Welcome. My name is Peter Kraus. I'm very excited to see you all here today for the second in a series here with MENA MIT, dealing with the broader Middle East and politics of the region. I know obviously there's been a lot of stuff in the news related to our topic for today, so looking forward to engaging with all of you. I know we have a great crowd and look forward to having a bunch of questions and discussions throughout the talk. As always, I have some slides I'm going to share with you, so let me just pull those up. Right, and just making sure that everyone can see everything okay here. Okay, excellent. All right. And maybe panelists, just always give me a thumbs up in the chat as well if the slides are coming through okay, just so I know that everything looks all right on your end. But as I mentioned, this talk is entitled U.S. Gaza and the Future for Palestinians. It's actually the second in a series of 4 talks. So the first one, where I saw a number of you back in September, focused on U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East, North Africa under Trump. If you did not attend that talk, there actually is a recording of it. And so if you like, or if you know other people who you feel like might be interested in looking at Trump's foreign policy in the Middle East and the impact on the peoples of the region, and what may come next, a lot of that is still very relevant for what we're going to talk about today and what's going to happen going forward. So you can check that out. Today's talk, as I mentioned, is on Gaza and US and the Palestinians, of course. And then 2 subsequent talks, one in November, one in December coming up, one on Iran-Israeli relations, and one on the Abraham Accords. And of course, all of these things intersect. The first talk talked about a bunch of the things for sessions 2 through 4. And today we'll engage with some of that stuff as well. So what am I going to talk about today? 4 key things. The voices of Gazans, characteristics of Gaza and pre-October 7th history, challenges for Gaza and the Trump plan, and Israeli and Palestinian public opinion. But I want to start with just a couple of announcements and a couple kind of points right off the bat. So the first is I just want to say, I know that many, if not most of you, are here because you care deeply about this issue. You care deeply about the Gazans and the Palestinians. You care deeply about the Israelis. You care, maybe as an American, I know many of you are, living in the United States or otherwise, you care about U.S. foreign policy on this issue. And I don't think any of us look at the situation today and say, yes, this is the way I want things to be. I want the situation with Gaza and with Israel to be exactly how it's been the past couple of years. I think all of us in one way or another want things to be different and hopefully better for the peoples of the region. And that's a lot of the motivation for why we're all here today. And I share that same motivation. As I've done in my prior talks, we're going to have these different sections, and I'm not just going to do Q&A at the very end for, 15 minutes. We're going to do like 4 Q&A and discussion sections throughout the talk. So after each one of these sections, I'll pause and I'll go to the chat and go to the questions that you have asked, and I'll answer as many of them as I can. A couple of points on the Q&A. Some of you love to ask a ton of questions, and some of you are a little more reticent, which is fine. I will just say for the folks that like to ask a ton of questions, I will go to people that I have not answered questions before first. So if you're someone who has like 10 different questions you want to pose, I probably won't be able to get to all 10 of them. So try to be a bit more discriminating in what questions you really want to ask and have me answer, and I'll do my best to address as many as I can. And I'll also say in terms of the questions, just, I'll answer any questions. So there's no elephants in the room or things that I'm not comfortable talking about. Ask me anything you like about the situation and the stuff I'm presenting here. I'm happy to engage in it. The only thing I would ask is that sometimes in these sessions, questions can be more of a comment than a question. They're sometimes directed at other questions by audience members. It's fine to have engagement, but let's just keep it focused on, of course, the things we're discussing here today. So with that, let's begin. And we're going to start by talking about the voices of actual Gazans, because from my perspective, there's lots of discussion about the situation in Gaza, what should come next with Gaza, what about the Trump plan with Gaza, and I think a lot of the times we have these discussions without including actual Gazans and the voices of the Gazan people themselves. And so, as many of you know, over my summers, I work with Israelis and Palestinians, helping to teach the history of the peoples to each other, helping to lead facilitations and dialogues. It actually includes not just Israeli Jews and Palestinians from the West Bank or Jerusalem or elsewhere, but also Gazans. And so before this talk, I reached out to a few of the Gazans that I know from these sessions, as well as some Israelis, and asked for their insights on the current situation and things that they're thinking. And I particularly asked them, what are some things that Americans don't really know or understand about the situation, or that's not covered as much in American media, that you would like people to know? And so I want to start there today. So first, and again, I'm not going to go through the individual people, but going with the words that they sent me. So one of the Gazans that I reached out to and responded said, look, The main thing I wish people understood is that not all of us in Gaza support Hamas. It's unfair and deeply marginalizing to assume that 2 million people chose or support them. I often see comments online saying, quote, Gaza deserves this because they elected Hamas. But that's as nonsensical as saying 100% of Americans supported Trump. It's simply not true. Yes, Hamas had high popularity when they took over in 2006, but that's been declining over the years, especially after October 7th, 2023. Many of us in Gaza, like my family and me, have paid a huge price for something we never chose. I've lost 10 of my cousins, my aunt and her entire family, our home, and even my pet. For what? I'm 27 years old and have never voted. There haven't been any elections since Hamas took power in 2006, so people never had a chance to choose different leadership. So again, interesting perspective there that you may or may not have seen. I'm going to present some polls later that go into some of these issues, but just a couple things to kind of, engage on these points that were raised. So the first is this individual mentioned the last Palestinian elections, which were in 2006. And again, it's not incorrect to say that Hamas won those elections. In fact, it's correct to say Hamas won those elections. But it's also interesting to know, and I bet most people on this call have not, actually go into the elections themselves and where the voting actually happened and who was elected from different regions. So many people maybe know about the Israeli electoral system. We'll get into that a little bit later. But in terms of the Palestinian electoral system, it's actually what we call a mixed PR or proportional representation system with, again, a low threshold to entry, which is why you have a lot of different potential Palestinian parties. Some of the elected officials came from just general percentage based on the percentage of votes they got across all of the Palestinian population. But some of them were tied to certain districts, and that's the map we see here on the right. Any of the squares that you see in green, those were seats that were won by Hamas. Now, one of the things that may stick out to you is actually Hamas did quite well in the West Bank. Sometimes people stereotypically say, oh, Gaza, that's Hamas, the West Bank, that's Fatah or the PA. In terms of actual public opinion, that's not exactly accurate. In the 2006 election, Hamas did quite well. In fact, Hamas won every single seat in Hebron in the southern West Bank. On the other hand, if you look at parts of Gaza, including Rafah, obviously a major area that's in the news in recent years and months, all of the seats there were won by Fatah, not by Hamas. And you can see in Khan Yunis, you also see a mix in terms of who won. So when we have these narratives about what happened in 2006, again, correct to say Hamas won, but not incorrect to say, as the Gazan who wrote to me said, not everyone in Gaza, first of all, voted because a majority of Gazans are still quite young today, and people even 27 years old haven't voted. But then even for those who did vote, Fatah actually won a decent number of the seats. Hamas won a decent number as well. But Hamas in some ways actually performed even better in the West Bank than in Gaza. So key points to take away from this story are that it's not always exactly black and white in terms of where public support is for Palestinians in these different areas, but also the fact that there has not been elections for Palestinians in almost 20 years is maybe the biggest issue regarding the lack of legitimate leadership for the Palestinian people. And I'll show you polls later that look at the fact that, like, you can ask Palestinians, would you vote for Khaled Meshal or Mahmoud Abbas or Marwan Barghouti, and you still get huge chunks, sometimes the majority of Palestinians who say none of these people. Because again, they don't really feel, most Palestinians don't feel that Hamas or the PA necessarily represents their opinion. And again, they haven't had the chance to actually vote and show that. Another thing I'll note that, again, dovetails a little bit with this point from the Gazan individual at the outset is that this was a fascinating poll. And I may have shown you this in a prior talk if you were with me a year or two ago, but this comes from the Arab Barometer. If you don't know about the Arab Barometer, it's arguably the best wave of polls that happen across the Middle East every couple of years. It's done by researchers at Princeton and University of Michigan, and they just happened to be polling Gazans on October 6, 2023. No idea what was going to happen the next day. And one of the questions that they asked was this: how much trust do you have in the Hamas-led government? And again, going to the idea of, like, how do people in Gaza feel about Hamas? The most common answer, almost half of the people said they had no trust at all in the Hamas-led government. If you include none at all, along with not a lot, you get well over 60%, almost 70% of Gazans saying they have none or very little trust in a Hamas-led government. Now, this is different than whether they want Hamas to be fully disarmed or whether when there's violence with Israelis that they don't support, violence by Hamas against the Israelis, back at the Israelis. So the challenge here is distinguishing between Not everyone in the same region, of course, feels the same way, but then also there's differences of opinion regarding Hamas in terms of its actual governance and governing performance versus its holding of arms versus its attacks against Israel, which I'll show you polls about later. So again, I think this individual who shared a bit about her opinion and the opinion of many people in her family more broadly about Hamas, there is some data that kind of supports this. Another thing that an individual from Gaza wrote was the following. I wish more people could see what Gaza was like before the war. Despite everything, the electricity shortages, unsafe water, restrictions on travel, and the Israeli siege, we still made this place beautiful. We built lives and joy out of hardship. What's happening now is a brutal reality none of us were ever used to. It breaks my heart to see people online say Gaza, quote, has always been like this. It hasn't. Now, I don't know if any of you have seen stuff like this before, but I'm going to show you a brief clip from NBC that just a minute long, but it goes through some drone footage in terms of where actually what Gaza looked like in certain time periods, both before October 7th, 2023 and the aftermath of it. So again, there's not going to be sound on this, but just check out the visual in terms of building off of what this individual said, what the area actually looked like before and after the past 2 years. Okay, so again, just gives you a sense of the before and after of just the physical destruction of many parts of the Gaza Strip, which we'll talk more about. But again, I think sometimes just hearing words on a page or hearing someone write something is not certainly the same as actually seeing with your own eyes. So with that, let's come back to some of the slides that I want to share here. Okay. And then a final Gazan voice that I wanted to share. And then later on, I'll share some Israeli voices as well in terms of their insights. So this individual shared a bunch of different things regarding the situation on the ground for Gazans today. So said the following. First, Gaza is fully destroyed. This is not something just for media attention. It is the reality. There is no local farming, no water supplies, and no sewage infrastructure. The remaining buildings are unstable. The IDF controls more than 54% of the Gaza Strip, and these areas are no-go zones. Anyone who takes the risk of entering, whether a child, woman, or elder, will be shot. People are living in a state of extreme desperation due to the uncertainty of their situation. Will the ceasefire hold? Will Israel continue the war after the bodies are recovered? Will there ever be a reconstruction? What is next for our future, our past, or our loved ones? There are so many questions with no answers or a clear path forward. Happiness is a luxury and unemployment is rampant. The media don't seem to care about the people of Gaza, keeping them in the dark. There has been a full electricity blackout since October 10th, 2023. Before the war, it was at best 8 hours a day. People are living in tents, and while camping for a day or two might be an adventure, living in a tent for over a year is horrifying. It's hot in the summer, cold in the winter, with no privacy and the constant threat of being robbed. There is a severe lack of fresh or drinkable water, which has caused many illnesses throughout the war. There is no propane or other means for heating, which has forced people to burn waste to cook or stay warm. This is not wood or proper fuel, but literal waste, resulting in significant lung issues. There are countless other daily struggles. The only small mercy is that for those of us Gazans living outside of Gaza, we can now sleep a little better, not constantly waking up to the fear of news that we have lost more loved ones. So again, very difficult, but I think important things to hear about the experience for Gazans that are actually on the ground today and have been over the past couple of years. So I'll go into a little bit later some of these points and analysis of them and some broader issues, but I just want to say, whether it's the Trump administration's plan or whatever else comes next, plans for the future of Gaza that do not account for the voices of Gazans are unlikely to succeed. And I think we know this historically, whether it's most recently with the past couple of years, or you can go back to the 1980s when there was a feeling of, oh, okay, Gaza's pretty quiet and controlled, etc. And then the first Intifada breaks out in December 1987 from a group of people who felt like, no, the situation is not good here. It's not tolerable. It's not something that we want to keep the status quo. And so ultimately, I think it's important, whether in terms of media coverage or discussions about the future, that again, it's not just something that's being planned by the United States government, the Europeans, Arab states, Gazans and Israelis and others from the region obviously have to play a key role in that as well. Okay, so let me go through a couple characteristics of Gaza in pre-October 7th history, and then I'll pause and we can do our first round of questions, and I'll get into some stuff about present day. So first, important to note that the Gaza Strip itself is not some natural area that's, bordered by water or mountains or otherwise. Historically, and this is a map that looks at some of the historic trading routes in the region, whether by land or by sea, it's generally been on some of these broader trading routes that interconnected to other parts of the broader region, not just locally in the Levant, but even more broadly through the ocean. In terms of the strip itself, as many of you I'm sure know, it was created as a result of the 1948 war. So, not to go too deep into the history here, but basically, when the British were going to leave the mandate for Palestine, they turned it over to the UN. The UN Commission made a recommendation of basically having a Jewish or Israeli state here in the blue, having an Arab or Palestinian state in the red and the green, and then ultimately having Jerusalem be an international capital because it was holy to all three monotheistic faiths. Ultimately, that did not happen. There was a conflict that occurred first initially between Zionist and Palestinian and Arab forces, kind of in a civil war of sorts. And then the day after Israel declared its independence, an invasion of multiple Arab armies that you can see pictured here, that Israel eventually beat back and actually captured not just the blue areas, but also the red areas here for the state of Israel, which exists to this day. The Gaza Strip, this kind of green area here, is simply the armistice lines between the Egyptian army and the Israeli military in 1948-49. So it's this strip that, again, comes out of conflict, but has basically been, since then, a territory that has been somewhat unique in terms of world history in the sense that it's not formally part of any state. Unlike the West Bank, which Jordan annexed after the 1948 war, Egypt did not annex the Gaza Strip, even though they administered it. When Israel controlled the Gaza Strip after 67, as we'll talk about, also did not annex the territory. So Gaza is somewhat unique in the world today, and I think fully unique if you combine these three factors, that it's not formally part of any state. The majority of the population is actually refugees. And this graphic I'm pulling from here is not about this exact time period, but it actually looks at the identities of Palestinians that were killed in 2014 when you had violence and rockets from Hamas going into Israel, you had Israeli airstrikes into Gaza, and these are some of the identities of the Palestinians in Gaza who were killed during some of this violence back a little over 10 years ago. And you can see some of the areas that they had come from initially. So even though, yes, about 30% of Gaza are native Gazans, people whose families have lived there for generations, many, many generations, the majority of the population in Gaza are actually refugees from 1948. And again, a lot of the areas that they come from are listed here. Finally, Gaza is somewhat unique in the world in the sense that all of its borders are controlled by its neighbors. So even after Israel's withdrawal in 2005, which we'll talk about, Israel maintains control of kind of two of its land borders and its sea border, and Egypt maintains control, basically between 2005 to, about 2 years ago, the Philadelphia corridor between Gaza and Egypt. So Palestinians in Gaza facing somewhat of a unique situation here where they're cut off from much of the rest of the world, not formally part of any state, generally don't have citizenship in a state, and many of them are refugees living in a difficult situation because of that. I mentioned the 67 war. This was the time in which Israel captured Gaza along with the West Bank, East Jerusalem, the Golan Heights, and the Sinai. The buildup to this conflict was Gamal Abdel Nasser, the president of Egypt, and other Arab states saying that they were going to, quote, reverse the Nakba and kind of, destroy the Israeli state. They mobilized troops. They blockaded the Straits of Tiran. They had a lot of very aggressive rhetoric vis-a-vis Israel. In part because of this, Israel launched a preemptive strike against Egypt and then later on attacks against Syria and Jordan, tripled its territory. And since that time period in 67, Israel controlled Gaza up until 2005 in terms of actually having settlers and IDF inside of it. And then since 2005, kind of on three of its four borders. As I mentioned, in terms of other key points in the history of Gaza, the first Intifada actually started in Gaza. After a truck accident and some local, protests and riots thereafter, and it's something that shocked not just the Israeli leadership, but also the Palestinian leadership. So going back to this point about the importance of the voices of Gazans, you had both the Israelis and the PLO feeling like, okay, things are pretty quiet in Gaza on the West Bank. The center of gravity for the Palestinian national movement in the early to mid 80s was actually in Tunisia after being in Lebanon. And so ultimately, having this mass popular uprising in Gaza and in the West Bank shocked these leaderships and made people realize, like, this is not kind of a status quo that can just endure without having, significant unrest. And so ultimately, the First Intifada helped to shift the center of gravity for the Palestinian leadership from external countries, whether in Jordan or in Lebanon or in Tunisia or Algeria, ultimately back into Gaza and the West Bank. Now, I mentioned the Israeli withdrawal from Gaza. And again, if you want to watch an excellent documentary on this, I commend to you the documentary Unsettled, which actually shows great internal debate inside of Israeli society over this withdrawal. And honestly, that's debate that's only increased to this day because when Israel pulled back from Gaza in 2005, they took out all 8,000 Israeli Jewish settlers that were inside of the territory. They had their military, as you can see here, kind of pulling those individuals out. They pulled their troops out of the territory and then had it kind of ring the broader Gaza Strip. This documentary, which I would commend to you, looks at all of these different perspectives. It actually interviews both religious and secular Israeli settlers who were there at the time, talking to them about this withdrawal and whether they want to go and why they want to stay. It chronicles Israelis who are activists who want Israel to pull out of Gaza and why they want that to happen. It actually follows members of the Israeli military as they're training to withdraw Israeli Jews from Gaza and kind of their feelings about that. So if you want to see internal Israeli debate about Gaza, kind of in the last key period that still resonates today, check out this documentary. It's very well done in terms of presenting these different perspectives. But why this is so important, I think, even for the Israeli narrative today, is that even though the guy who did this, Ariel Sharon, is someone who's certainly one of the godfathers of kind of the broader settlement movement, both in the West Bank and in Gaza, he pulled back from Gaza in part to honestly maintain some control of the West Bank. But from many Israelis' perspective, they felt like, okay, we pulled back from this territory. And we didn't necessarily expect that immediately to lead to, kind of peace and stability and otherwise. But for many Israelis, they're like, we pulled back, and what we got in exchange is a year or two later, Hamas took over the territory. We get rockets from Gaza, and it becomes an even worse security situation than it was in Gaza during the Second Intifada. So it's still more of a fringe position in Israel that Israel should go back in and, settle Gaza or otherwise. But there are a number of Israelis who feel like it was either a mistake to pull out in 2005 or Israel should maintain tighter control of the borders of Gaza or otherwise because of the subsequent security issues that have come out of it. Now, voices of Israelis on the situation. Again, I also reached out to a number of Israelis that I know and asked them to say, okay, what do you think about the situation with Gaza? Like, how would you describe some of Israeli perspectives on the situation? So one individual wrote the following. Everyone was very happy to see the hostages back home and the war finished. I always try to tell my American friends that Trump's popularity here is 90% maybe. He's 5 times more popular than Bibi Netanyahu. He gets results and does stuff the public in Israel appreciates. On the other hand, people are concerned that not all parts of Trump's plan will happen, that Hamas will not disarm, that this is just a temporary halt in the fighting. A big number of the dead hostages have not been released, and nobody believes Hamas is actually trying to look for them. It's another one of their sick tricks, like how in February they gave back the Bibas family in that horrible way. A lot of Israelis will want Gaza to be demilitarized and Hamas to be dismantled. The second best possible option is what is happening in Lebanon, which means there are forces that pressure Hezbollah and strike them on a regular basis, but not all-out war. For the vast majority of us, Gaza is like Lebanon, an enemy territory that invaded us after we withdrew. I know there is context there with 1948, 1967, etc., but Hamas didn't take that opportunity after our withdrawal. Instead, they built a terror army. I've read articles about Sinwar and Hamas that they filmed their brutality on October 7th on purpose to inspire fear in Israelis. They inspired fear, but they also made us think that you can never have peace with people like that. When you see lynchings of old people and people burned in their kibbutzim, even people like me who know people from Gaza and are very involved with Israeli-Palestinian initiatives, I doubt whether peace can be achieved, especially with Gazans. You can't make peace with Hamas, so you have to manage it, and Israelis differ in how to do so. So a bunch of things said there by the Israelis. Let me analyze that a little bit, and then we'll break and we'll do some Q&A and then keep going. So in terms of this statement about Trump's popularity, the polls back up this individual. So this is a poll from the Israeli Democracy Institute, just done, I think, a few days ago. And they were asked, Israelis were asked, to what extent do each of the following contribute to the agreement to end the conflict and release the hostages? And you can see the person or individual or group that got the most support in the sense of very much had an impact on this agreement was President Trump, followed by the IDF, followed by pressure from hostages families, followed by Netanyahu, and then public administration. So again, this isn't the exact same question as how popular Trump is, but the Israeli individual who responded there, I would agree, Trump's approval rating in Israel is probably north of 80%. And again, that's something that goes across left and right, although certainly there are some people in Israel who do not like Trump, particularly I would say on the left, but you still have some support for Trump even on the Israeli left. Now, he also mentioned this idea of managing the conflict. And even before, I would say not even, but especially before October 7th, this is the type of language that many Israelis would use. Anytime I was living over there and I was talking with Israeli politicians or people in security, they would be saying like, look, from their perspective, again, this isn't all Israelis, but particularly on the Israeli right and even a number on the Israeli center would say, look, you cannot solve this conflict, especially involving Hamas. They're irreconcilable regarding the existence of the state of Israel. And so ultimately, from the Israeli perspective, we need to manage the conflict, not solve the conflict. And this terminology that Ephraim Inbar, an Israeli scholar, and a number of others have used of mowing the grass, fit with a lot of the Israeli mindset regarding Gaza, which is basically there's not going to be a final resolution here. So every few years, Israel needs to go in, knock out members of Hamas, knock out Hamas missiles or otherwise and rockets, and that will establish some baseline of calm and deterrence again. But then in another year or two, you're going to have to kind of do it all again. And some people would say, as critics, both Israelis or otherwise, this is like tactical victories but strategic defeat. But for some Israelis who even supported the strategy, they would kind of throw up their hands and be like, this is the least bad option if we believe that there aren't people on the other side who are reconcilable or we're not willing to make the concessions necessary to kind of get there. So this was a lot of Israel's strategy for, I'd say, the decade before October 7th. But you can see even in the individual who responded, as much as some of this was delegitimized after Hamas's attack, because obviously this did not prevent or deter Hamas, there are still many Israelis who are now looking around and being like, I don't know if there's anything better than this, because they don't believe Hamas will be disarmed, but they also don't believe in or support or think it's possible to have a two-state solution. And so this idea of kind of mowing the grass, when he's talking about Lebanon, that's kind of what he's mentioning. A number of Israelis still think that that maybe is the strategy going forward for Israel to follow. Final point on this, thinking about the Israeli leadership, and I'll talk a bit about the Palestinian leadership in a little bit. Before October 7th, this was part of Netanyahu's strategy, not just kind of mowing the grass, but also the idea that Hamas can kind of be satiated. They'll increase the work permits for Gazans to be coming into Israel and working there. They'll support Qatari funding of Hamas, which the Netanyahu government did. And the reason for this, and again, Netanyahu faced some criticism internally for this, were quotes like this. Netanyahu saying, quote, whoever is against a Palestinian state should be for transferring the funds to Gaza, because maintaining a separation between the PA and the West Bank and Hamas and Gaza prevents the establishment of a Palestinian state. In a similar lens, you can see Smotrich, again, the finance minister who has a lot of control of the West Bank, saying, again, a decade ago, the Palestinian Authority is a burden, but Hamas is an asset. Now, again, this does not mean, like you see in conspiracy theories online, that like Israel created Hamas. Israel did not create Hamas. But do you have Israeli officials who are like, the PA is actually a bigger problem than Hamas? Because from some of their perspectives, look, the PA has recognized the state of Israel. They have international legitimacy and support. And so for those Israeli politicians like Smotrich, but also to some extent Netanyahu, who don't want a Palestinian state, having the PA be strong is problematic because that's a stepping stone to a state of Palestine. Whereas for Hamas, which is persona non grata in most of the world, if Hamas is the leader of the Palestinians, then there's not going to be strong support for a two-state solution or Israeli reconciliation with the Palestinians. So for Smotrich, for Netanyahu, having this split between the two territories and the two organizations, but also starving the PA of tax funds, but actually having funding for Hamas was literally part of Israeli government strategy before October 7th. Okay. In terms of attacks from Gaza, I just want to say a couple of things, and then we'll have some discussion on this. So the attacks, as you can see detailed here, breaking through a variety of points in the wall around Gaza, going to and attacking surrounding kibbutzim, and ultimately Hamas trying to reach out to Beersheba. They don't get there. They get stopped by the IDF. But for a number of days, they have individuals who are attacking, taking hostages, and killing people in the area around the Gaza envelope, as you can see depicted here in this map. Part of the issue in terms of the attacks themselves is you have individuals coming out of the very extensive tunnel system that has been built and maintained to varying degrees, by Hamas, a lot of which has been destroyed by Israel in the past couple of years, but not all of it. As that Israeli individual mentioned, some of the motivation for Hamas was not just to try to, take territory or take hostages, but also to provoke a reaction and mobilize the broader Palestinian and broader Arab peoples against Israel. Again, the whole title of the attacks was the Al-Aqsa Flood, which Hamas was trying to mobilize the broader region against the Israelis. And so I think it's important to, again, to understand not just the motivation behind the attacks, but also how it's being perceived, not just by Palestinians, but also by Israelis in this context. Okay. I said a lot to start there. We're going to next go to some of the challenges in Gaza today, but I'll stop here for the moment and I will go to Q&A and questions. So I'm open to questions on anything, but particularly on things that I've mentioned so far regarding perceptions and voices of Gazans, perceptions and voices of Israelis, and kind of the pre-October 7th history and situation in Gaza. So I'll start with some questions there and answer those, and then we'll get into some challenges in Gaza today. Okay, right off the bat, a question. If so few people in Gaza supported Hamas, why didn't the Gazans try to get rid of them? So first, to be clear, I wouldn't necessarily say that so few people did. I don't want to give an impression from the elections I showed you that like few people supported Hamas. Again, like even in Gaza, you saw Hamas won a number of seats in Gaza in the 2006 election. They won the majority of the seats overall in the 2006 election. So it would be wrong to anyone to imply that like few people supported Hamas in Gaza. A number of people did. Now, I think it is important to understand why they supported Hamas. Some of them are all on board with Hamas's vision in terms of eliminating a state of Israel, in terms of an Islamist-style state, in terms of the social and political mores of the country. So there are like true believers and true supporters of Hamas and their program. At the same time, it's also important to note a number of the votes that went to Hamas in 2006 came about as kind of a protest vote against Fatah and the PA, who were seen as corrupt and ineffectual, and actually had a split in their leadership between the old and young guard that also lost them some votes. So Hamas's performance in 2006, it was based on certainly some support, which I would not describe as few, but it also was boosted above what it probably was in terms of actual support for the group because of, as we know very well, whether in US politics or Israeli politics or anywhere else, some people vote not because they love who they're voting for, but because they really dislike who they're voting against, if that makes sense. Now, the second part of your question, why didn't the Gazans try to get rid of them? I mean, this is one of the challenges that we'll talk about a bit later with Hamas's public executions or cracking down on other clans and other groups inside of Gaza. Hamas was able to establish basically a monopoly of force inside of the territory. So at various points in the past 2 years, did you see some anti-Hamas protests inside Gaza? Yes, you did. But I will say that Hamas, especially before October 7th, had significant military control of the area, not just in terms of having their various forces, but also in terms of like treating very brutally with anyone that they accused of collaboration with the Israelis, which could include people who are critics of Hamas. So it's not like a situation in the United States where you can go and openly protest or do things like that, or even, start throwing things at, Hamas police force or otherwise, and that you're going to just be okay and like the Constitution is going to protect you. So that doesn't mean that people in very tough circumstances sometimes don't do that, but I think that that's a lot of the explanation for why among the people that did not like Hamas, first of all, they're dealing day to day with some of the things that were described by the individuals that I, told you about earlier, but also just it's a very, very dangerous game to try to do so. Now, maybe there's a window now because Hamas is a lot weaker than they were before, but it's a narrow one, and we'll talk a little bit later about how Hamas is trying to close it and trying to prevent being pushed out of power inside of Gaza. What about the implications for the 18 to 29 age group that trusts Hamas the most? Yeah, it's a great question. We see generational divides on a lot of this stuff, right? In the United States, we see generational divides on support for Israelis and support for Palestinians. Older individuals tend more towards supporting Israel. Younger individuals in the United States have been trending, especially recently, more towards supporting Palestinians. Of course, you don't have to be one or the other. Many people define themselves differently. But you're correct, going back to that chart for trust in the Hamas government, the youngest group was the one that was the most trusting of Hamas. I've got a couple of different hypotheses there. One can just be Older people have kind of lived through Hamas at that point. For now, when that poll is being done, over 15 years. And so they have seen, like Palestinians at the West Bank have seen, some of the ineffectual and corrupt aspects of Hamas leadership. And so 18 to 29-year-olds, they're just kind of coming of age and paying attention to politics for the first time. They probably going to be the ones who are more likely to tend towards supporting, use of force or things like that vis-a-vis the Israelis. But also they haven't had this longer period going back to the Second Intifada of seeing what has Hamas governance actually looked like and delivered or not delivered. So I think that to me, those are two of the key factors that matter there. Okay, other questions here. I said 56% of Gazans in 2014 were refugees from Israel. Were they refugees themselves or descendants of refugees? Well, very interesting question. So first, to be clear, there's not actually a differentiation between that according to the UN and according to international law. Refugee status actually passes from parents to children, and this is not actually unique just to the Palestinian situation, which sometimes people say online, which is a myth. Refugee status has passed through from parents to children and grandchildren in places like Afghanistan or Ethiopia. What is unique about the Palestinian refugee situation is that, unlike in some of those other conflicts, this conflict has been ongoing now for, 7+ decades. And so the two ways that refugee situations usually get resolved have not been allowed to happen. On the one hand, in 1948, the Israeli Knesset passed a law saying that regardless of the reasons that Palestinians became refugees, they cannot return to their homes inside of Israel. Simultaneously, no Arab state except for Jordan gives citizenship to Palestinian refugees. And so, again, the two ways refugee situations usually get resolved is either they go back to their homes or they get repatriated and become citizens in the places that they're living. Both of those options are basically closed to almost all Palestinians, minus a couple million refugees that Jordan took in, again, not just out of the goodness of their heart, but because Jordan annexed and claimed the West Bank as their own territory. So normally when you annex a territory, you treat everyone inside of it as citizens. So in that sense, this is one of the reasons that, yes, going to your point, the people who are living in Gaza today, there are still thousands of them who are alive in 48, but the vast majority were not alive in 48. But according to the UN international law, they still get refugee status because they have not been given citizenship and repatriated elsewhere. They have not been allowed to come back to their homes either. All right, a couple more questions here, and then I will go back to the next section. But again, I'll come back and answer some of these as well later. Someone asked about why the Palestinians are the only people rooted as refugees forever. I think I just answered that. And again, they're not the only one that's passed through things, but it is the fact that, as I mentioned, they're caught between a rock and a hard place. Israelis won't let them back in. Arab states won't give them citizenship. We can get to the motivations for both of those. On the Israeli side, the Palestinians are generally seen as an enemy population and one that would upset the demographic balance of Israel with a Jewish majority. For the Arab states, they also have some of their own demographic balances. Take a place like Lebanon, where they have a very delicate balance between Sunni Muslims, Shia Muslims, Maronite Christians, etc. Having majority Sunni Muslim population of Palestinians come in as citizens can upset that balance. It helped to spark the Lebanese civil war in the 1970s and 80s. Arab states also see this as Israel's issue and want to keep pressure on Israel regarding the Palestinian refugee issue as well. So if you want to say, are Palestinian refugees somewhat of a tool of some of these states in the region, including the Israelis and Arab states? I think yes. And again, Palestinians suffer as a result of that. Okay. Sorry, there's just a lot of questions here. I want to make sure I get to a bunch of different folks. Was there ever any intention to achieve a peace by the successive Israeli governments and find a solution that did not eventually lead to annexation and depopulation? So yeah, I mean, I think the answer is yes, but I also think that was there an offer from different Israeli states that would, fulfill the goals of all the Palestinians? I think probably not, just as the offers made were not fully in line with what many Israelis would want. So going to this question, if you were to ask me, what were the answers or what were the situations in which there was actually an attempt by Israeli governments to find a solution that was not leading to, now you say annexation, depopulation. On the extreme version, the answer is definitely yes, because, whether it was Ehud Olmert's offer or even Ehud Barak's offer in the waning days of the Clinton administration, these were plans that would not have led to certainly full Israeli annexation of the West Bank or Gaza and depopulation. In most of those plans, all of Gaza would have become part of a state of Palestine with no removal of the population in Gaza. Most of the West Bank would have become part of a state of Palestine. Some Israeli settlement blocks would have been annexed, but there would have been an exchange of land, actually some around Gaza under some of these plans. So do I think that you've had some Israeli politicians who have been making offers to try to resolve the conflict that would not lead to annexation, depopulation? Yes. At the same time, do you have a growing number of Israelis who support the idea of annexation of the West Bank or support the idea of depopulating it? I mean, yes, you can see this in polls. The Israeli right has grown in strength over time. We could talk about the reasons behind that, but you do get polls that you get sometimes over 50% of Israelis today, especially post October 7th, saying that they support the idea of having some degree of depopulation or removal or ethnic cleansing, or whatever terminology you want to use, of removal of Palestinians from the West Bank or Gaza and annexation, at least of some part of the West Bank. And as you may have seen just a week or two ago, the Israeli Knesset actually did a vote that, again, had a lot of issues to it, but did pass in terms of the Knesset saying they want to annex the West Bank. Now, again, annexation is normally something not controlled by the Knesset, it's controlled by the government. And again, that's just the first vote of what would have to be multiple ones. But you're not wrong to imply that this is certainly in the ether. But I would say that have you ever had offers from the Israelis that don't include this? My answer would be yes. Okay, one or two more, and then I'll come back into some more stuff for present day. How is it that Hamas ended up in power in Gaza but not the West Bank when the 2006 elections had Hamas winning in both regions? Great question. So initially, Ismail Haniyeh was going to be the PA, the head of the PA, and technically Hamas should have taken over leadership of the PA, even though Fatah would have had some main key parts of it. The issue is that the Palestinian Authority is created as a result of the Oslo Accords. Under the terms of the Oslo Accords, the PLO recognized the state of Israel, agreed to kind of give up terrorism and move to having a police force and kind of do the basics of the beginning to build a potential state, at least control of autonomous areas. Hamas did not agree to those terms. So because Hamas did not agree to recognize Israel, forswear political violence against civilians, these types of steps, basically a combination of the Israelis, the Americans, and Fatah all basically marginalized Hamas. A number of Hamas elected officials got arrested in the West Bank, and they were basically not allowed to take power in the West Bank by those three forces. It's one of the reasons that thereafter Hamas then said, okay, well, we're going to carry out a coup of sorts inside of Gaza, and they expelled the PA from Gaza in 2006, 2007. And that from that point on is when Hamas controlled Gaza. So it comes down to the fact that, again, the PA is this somewhat unique body that is this like semi-state institution, but its creation is based on some agreements with the Israelis, shepherded by the Americans. And Fatah has been willing to make some of those concessions, Hamas has not. And so that's why you see this split after 2006. It's also one of the reasons you don't see elections since 2006, because anytime you get close to elections, like say in 2021, Mahmoud Abbas looks at the polls and realizes he's going to lose. Sometimes Hamas looks at them and doesn't necessarily like the polls. So you have this situation where the Palestinians do not, unfortunately, have regular, free, and fair elections that just happen regardless. It's kind of like the parties and the candidates themselves have to decide if and when they want to ever have elections. So you combine that with the fact that the Israeli government often doesn't want elections, especially among Jerusalemites, and you don't get Palestinian elections for now almost 20 years. Okay, two final questions I'll read and then I'll get into it. How much support was there for Gaza in the October 7th attacks? I'll in fact show you a poll on that just a little bit later. Isn't Israel also a country of refugees, including 700,000 to 1 million Jews driven out of Arab countries? So yes, in prior sessions, which again, you're welcome to watch the recordings of, what this individual is pointing to is that the state of Israel and the Zionist movement initially was created by a number of Jews, particularly in Europe, but also elsewhere, who were mobilized by both anti-Semitism and pogroms and physical threats to them. But especially after the 1948 war, you had over 700,000 basically Mizrahi Jews, those who are, for at least recent generations, in the Middle East and North Africa, and again, Sephardi Jews as well, coming from southern Spain, who then moved to Israel. A number of them had homes that were, and properties that were confiscated by countries in North Africa and the Middle East. And so any final resolution to the conflict has to deal not only with the Palestinian refugee issue from 48 and to a lesser degree 67, but yes, also Jewish refugees, some of whom have issues in terms of Europe. And there's been, I think, more progress with European countries there in terms of crimes committed against the Jews. But in terms of Middle East, North Africa, or Mizrahi Jews, that's still an issue that has to be resolved. Okay, great questions. I promise to come back to more, and I know there'll be more, but let's keep going with some of the issues in Gaza today, beyond just some of the stuff that we talked about. Okay. Oh, sorry. So first challenge we want to discuss, the humanitarian situation. And I mentioned a little bit of this before from one of the voices of Gazans that I shared, but just to give you some basic data here. In terms of food security, you have about half of Gazans that are relying on humanitarian aid as their main food source. So obviously, the issue of aid and an influx of aid into Gaza is a very, very important one because you've had a variety of NGOs talking about, the beginnings or elements of potential famine in parts of the Gazan population. People who are able to eat, two-thirds of them are burning waste to cook. So again, it goes to that point from the individual before. When you're burning waste, obviously that's not only not very energy efficient, but it's a big health hazard in terms of the flames and stuff that you're inhaling, sometimes inside of a tent. Much of Gaza's agricultural land has been destroyed or damaged, and as I'll talk about a bit later, much of it is actually in the yellow, but inside the yellow line that Israel currently controls. So the areas that Israel has withdrawn from as a result of the Trump plan is a lot of the residential areas, but then a lot of the farmland and places like that are in the eastern parts of Gaza that Israel currently controls. So Palestinians also cannot currently really access that cropland, much of which has been damaged. There's issues regarding water, and then stuff that's not talked about as much. Even before October 7th, there were studies of this, of Palestinian children in Gaza and Israeli children in communities surrounding Gaza, many of whom suffered from varying degrees of PTSD or otherwise because of the threat or constant violence that they've been exposed to. Obviously, with the October 7th attacks and the Israeli invasion of Gaza thereafter, this has been escalated to a significant degree. So beyond just kind of the physical ailments that people are suffering, the mental ones I think shouldn't be overlooked either. In terms of actual population flows, before October 7th, the plurality, if not the majority of Gazans were concentrated in the northern part of the Strip. As a result of the Israeli invasion, many of those folks were kind of pushed to kind of go further south, to the point that you may remember, Rafah had maybe 1 million people at one point, which is far more than they had before the conflict. One of the key challenges here is, how is this aid going to get into Gaza and who is going to distribute it? So one of the most contentious issues has been UNRWA. So if you don't know about UNRWA, the UN basically before 1951 used to have specific UN bodies that dealt with each refugee population. So this is another sometimes myth that people say, where they're like, the Palestinians are the only refugee population that's ever had a UN body specifically devoted to them. Incorrect. In the Korean War, there was one created as well, but it is correct to say since 1951, all refugee bodies have been dealt with by the UNHCR, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, and those other ones have mostly been resolved. So today, UNRWA pretty much does stand as kind of this unique body that's dealing with and has dealt with for generations now education for Palestinians, not just in Gaza, but in the West Bank and Lebanon and elsewhere, providing aid to them. And so this has been one of the key bodies that's used to doing this. Now, what's become an issue, and I'll talk about how it's an issue even before October 7th, but there was findings that 12 or so individuals from UNRWA in varying degrees were involved or participated in the October 7th attacks. It led to the US, as well as the Canadians, the Europeans, many others, kind of freezing or pulling funding from UNRWA. Most countries have now reinstated that funding after some of those individuals have been dealt with, but the US has not done so. And actually, to be clear, this was not frozen most recently under the Trump administration. Is actually frozen under the Biden administration, but the Trump administration has no plans of kind of reigniting or resending aid to Gaza. In fact, you saw Marco Rubio just a day or two ago saying that UNRWA is actually a subsidiary of Hamas, saying it's not going to play any role in delivering aid. So if you look at UNRWA's own reporting, their ability to do food assistance has been significantly curtailed or almost entirely eliminated, but they have continued in Gaza to provide stuff regarding healthcare or some degree of education or otherwise. Now, the World Court has said UNRWA has to be able to operate, but again, the United States is not providing aid, and there's a lot of disputes over this organization, not just with October 7th, but actually, if you go back to the prior Trump administration, you may remember the U.S. ambassador to the UN was Nikki Haley. And even in that time, now we're talking, 7, 8 years ago, Haley and the Trump administration said UNRWA is actually not serving the Palestinian people, and again, implying to varying degrees that it's been captured either by Hamas or by other actors. One of the arguments that Haley made goes to some of the questions that some of you are asking about the Palestinian refugee status, basically saying, from Haley's perspective, UNRWA is serving the Palestinians in the sense that they're providing aid or they're providing education, but from her perspective, not serving the Palestinians in the sense of trying to actually resolve their refugee status. So the argument the Trump administration made was like other refugee populations, or unlike them, the Palestinian refugees are not being pushed or helped to kind of repatriate or have Arab states actually accept them as citizens or otherwise. Again, I went through some of the reasons for that, but this was a charge made by the prior Trump administration, and one of the reasons that UNRWA, I think, will continue to exist, but I think US support for it is probably gone for quite a while, if not forever. Okay, another challenge, the return of the Israeli hostages. Now, all of the living Israeli hostages have been returned to Israel, but there's a number, unfortunately, of dead bodies of hostages that have not been returned to the Israelis. Now, if you go to the Trump plan, the claim was that within 72 hours, all of the hostages will be returned, but they did recognize that all of the bodies might not be able to return in that time frame. So what was provided for was basically Hamas is required to provide all of the relevant information that it has concerning these deceased hostages through this mechanism that would then have not just them, but Egypt and other surrounding states go in with equipment to try to, if people are buried under rubble, to get them out, or otherwise kind of search and bring their bodies back into Israel. So this is an ongoing issue, but it's certainly a smarting one, especially for Israelis, especially for the families of hostages. Again, even if they know that their family members are deceased, being able to bury them will provide a sense of closure and justice to the situation, even though obviously they'll still be incredibly upset about, what's happened for their family members. So this is an ongoing issue. In terms of why this is happening, I don't think we have perfect information, but it certainly makes some sense to me that Hamas has some incentive and certainly precedent, as that Israeli individual mentioned, for not returning all of the bodies. So what he was referencing is that when the Bibas family was returned in coffins, and again, this macabre ceremony, one of the coffins actually did not contain a member of the Bibas family, but somebody else. So Hamas's kind of key piece of leverage over the Israelis here are the hostages. They've obviously given back all the living ones, but do I think it stands to possibility that Hamas knows where some of the bodies of the ones that haven't been returned are, and or is even holding one or two of them as kind of a final card vis-a-vis the Israelis? I do think that's possible, but I don't have information to say that that's definitely the case. This is something that's being, worked on and honestly fought over between the sides here. Third issue, disarmament of Hamas. So the Trump plan calls for Hamas to disarm, quote, under the supervision of independent monitors. And to be clear, this is one of the big gains that's been gotten, kind of for the US and the Israeli side of things. And I'll talk some on the other side in a moment. But basically getting that claim for Hamas to be disarmed to be endorsed by all of the European states, the Arab states. This is pretty much a universally called for step at this point. Doesn't mean it's going to happen, which I'll talk about, but the claim of Hamas needing to disarm is something that has been basically unified by Americans, Israelis, Europeans, and Arab states, saying that this is what needs to happen as a result of this ceasefire deal. Now, Hamas has said it would only surrender its weapons to a Palestinian state, kind of, putting these conditions on there. Israel has, of course, called for immediate disarmament. The Trump plan leaves it pretty ambiguous. They say this needs to happen, but they have not said it needs to happen right now or before this or that. And in fact, as Hamas has been taking some steps in recent days that I'll talk about, the Trump administration, at least publicly, has said, that's okay. We can kind of work around that for now. So whether Hamas is going to disarm or not, I think goes to a couple key factors. The first, this is a picture here on the right of a RAND study from about a decade and a half ago, but it looked at different armed and terrorist groups worldwide about when they actually stopped committing violent attacks against civilians and or gave up their arms. You can see the most common ending for these groups are either A, policing. So those are groups not like Hamas that don't get to the size of having, thousands of members and controlling territory, and actually police forces are able to basically dismantle them. That's not going to be a solution here for Hamas. Or politics, which is basically the group like, say, the IRA with Sinn Féin gives up its arms as part of joining the political process and then advocating for what it wants that way. That has also, at least in terms of the actual plan, been foreclosed to Hamas because, again, the Trump plan calls for Hamas to be disarmed and have no role in the future governance of Gaza. So basically, because of Hamas's strength, it's difficult to just police them out of existence in terms of their arms. And then because of the feelings of the Americans and the Israelis and honestly others in the region, politics is kind of seemingly off the table. So now we're down to, again, if it's going to follow previous precedent, either victory, which again seems incredibly unlikely for Hamas, which despite its strength is quite, weak vis-a-vis the Israelis, or military force and destruction of the group, which to be honest is what the Israelis have been trying the past 2 years. But despite their best efforts, Hamas has not destroyed. They still have thousands of members. They have less arms and less leadership than before, but they're spread across multiple countries. So the idea that Hamas is going to be fully destroyed or disarmed just through military force, again, possible, but also pretty unlikely. So this comes to some of the challenges of how this is going to happen if it's actually going to happen. In terms of international bodies, there's a key distinction between peace enforcement and peacekeeping. If you want to have a UN mandated force go into Gaza, you could potentially get that. But generally, their mandate is going to be peacekeeping. Basically, we're going to keep the peace between the sides. But peace enforcement is more like, no, now we're going to go after and actually physically disarm a Hamas that does not want to be disarmed. That is usually beyond the mandate of UN forces, and it's certainly something that would give pause even to different Arab state governments about sending their forces there. If instead of just kind of like maintaining the peace, they're supposed to actively do military operations to disarm Hamas. So that's a real concern. In terms of the actual makeup of any international force that's going to go into Gaza, this is a key issue being hashed out right now. So the Turks obviously have one of the largest, if not the largest, militaries in the region that could send troops there. But the Israelis have said this is a red line to have Turkey be there because, again, Turkish-Israeli relations have not always been bad, but of late they've been quite bad. And so the Israelis do not want to have the Turks inside of Gaza. So who's it going to be? Could it be like Malaysians? Could it be the Emiratis? Generally, I think the belief among the Trump administration and others is you want it to be an Arab or Muslim majority country to have some greater degree of, cultural connection or legitimacy, although whether the Gazans see it that way, we'll see. But the makeup of this force is, totally undetermined. And whether you're going to get states who want to do this is going to depend a great deal on what are they actually there to accomplish. Are they there to just keep the peace, disarm Hamas? What's the ultimate goal for the territory? Is this just like military control and occupation of the Gazans forever? Is it moving towards something else? These are key questions that have to be hashed out before any force like this is going to be deployed. I'll also say that under the Trump plan, there's supposed to be no U.S. troops in Gaza, but the U.S. is supposed to oversee that force. So again, whether that's going to actually work, that remains to be seen. I will say, in terms of recent stories, you may have seen some of this if you follow social media or otherwise, like Hamas has put out the word at various points to like, if Gazans or others like see an unexploded ordnance, which there's a lot. Anytime there's a conflict or aerial bombing or things like we've seen the past 2 years, there's going to be bombs that don't explode, either because they're older, or they've got faulty mechanisms. Obviously, it's incredibly dangerous to approach one of those, but groups like Hamas, these are prizes potentially, because if they can and they have some know how to do this, take those bombs and, make it so they're not going to explode on them, but then they can use them as IEDs or otherwise. That's one of the main ways Hamas can get firepower in the subsequent couple of years, because right now, shipments going into Gaza, Israel basically has 360-degree control around it. So the ability for Hamas to import guns or ammunition or bombs is very, very limited. But around Gaza, which again poses a huge threat to Gazan civilians there are thousands of unexploded ordinances. And so, again, the idea of disarming Hamas is more challenging because of this. Okay, fourth challenge, Israeli withdrawal. The Trump plan calls for Israel to withdraw from Gaza in multiple stages. They've kind of carried out the first stage, but whether there's ever going to be another stage or further withdrawal kind of remains to be seen. So let's look at it. People talk about the green line with the West Bank, which is basically the line of armistice from 1948-49 between the West Bank and Israel. We now have the yellow line in and around Gaza. So in the yellow shaded areas here is where the Israeli military continues to be deployed. Going to the point that one of the Gazans raised before, this is basically a no-go zone for Gazans. If Gazans, step over that line, they're risking being shot. Israel has started in some places to put out like large yellow concrete structures as a way to identify and let Gazans know, like, this is where the yellow line is, like, don't go across this. So you do have some Gazans who are in these areas, but a majority of Gazans are kind of living in the white area here. There's a bunch of issues here regarding Israeli withdrawal. First off, the Netanyahu government in particular does not want to withdraw anymore. They certainly don't want to withdraw from the borders of Gaza. So even if Israel pulls back further into the yellow area, they're going to certainly maintain control of this border here, and they really want to maintain control of this area, which is called the Philadelphia corridor, basically making it so there is no border into Gaza that Israel does not control to prevent, again, flows of people, flows of weapons, these types, of things. So even if Israel withdraws further, I think it's unlikely, at least under Netanyahu, that they're going to withdraw from all of the borders, and certainly not the Philadelphia corridor, but we'll see. It's possible, but I would bet against it, at least in the short term. The other thing I mentioned is if you look at Gaza, a lot of these areas, right, Gaza City, Khan Yunis, Rafah, these are the populated areas, but then some of these eastern areas are kind of more the croplands or agricultural areas. That's where Israel is mostly controlling today. So what that means is, again, Gaza Strip in of itself is not really a self-sustaining entity. It requires a huge amount of aid because, again, there's not regular flows of people or trade or things like that. That's exacerbated by this current situation where even though a lot of these agricultural areas are bombed out or destroyed, some of them can be potentially made of use. But again, Palestinians can't currently access them. So that's, currently a challenge in terms of how this is being delineated. The final thing, and this goes again to the Israeli voice I mentioned before about managing the conflict, is if Arab states are going to be paying for the rebuilding of Gaza, which is a key part of the Trump plan, basically like get the Saudis, get the Emiratis, get the Qataris, like get other different Arab states with money to fund the reconstruction of Gaza for the people there, they're not going to want to invest their money if they think either A, Hamas is still in power, Israel is controlling this area, and it's unclear when that's going to change. The war is going to reignite. So, again, there are many funders who want to invest in the reconstruction of Gaza, and that may even include the Trump administration. But they're not going to invest when there's this very tenuous ceasefire that it seems like the parties aren't living up to their ends of it, that conflict could reignite, etc. And so before you get that type of investment commitment and reconstruction, even though the Israelis have said, oh, reconstruction can start in the yellow area, even if it can't start here while Hamas is in control, I think you're going to get a lot of reticence among Arab states to fund even a reconstruction here until there's more clarity about what's going to happen next. Some of this goes back to actually stuff that was happening during the conflict. So Israel was talking even before the past few months about a buffer zone. So Israelis look at the October 7th attacks and they say, look, this was a massive intelligence failure. There will probably be a state commission of inquiry, especially if Netanyahu doesn't win re-election, that will investigate why exactly the October 7th attacks were not thwarted or responded to more quickly by the IDF. But regardless, there's a lot of consensus in the Israeli security apparatus and elsewhere that Israel wants to have a bigger buffer zone inside of Gaza to make it so something like October 7th could not ever happen again. So even if Israel withdraws from the 54% or so of Gaza they currently control, Israel's going to try to maintain control of more area along the border. And in fact, they've already leveled and kind of set up some of that buffer zone close to the Gaza border inside of the Gaza side, not on the Israeli side. It's also important to note again, this is not just the Israelis dealing with border control here. You also have the Egyptians, who in the days after October 7th, especially when you had some Israeli ministers talking about repatriating or pushing Gazans into Egypt, Egypt kind of redoubled its construction of walls and kind of a secondary wall even behind some of the border in case any Palestinians were pushed or broke through, having a way to contain them and not allow them to go into the broader Sinai or Egyptian mainland. So the Egyptians are also very, very concerned about refugee or population flows into Egypt. Now, there have been some Gazans who have gone into Egypt. I know some of them, but most Gazans are inside of Gaza. I showed polls, I think, at a prior talk about how they feel about that. About a third want to stay in Gaza regardless. About a third would like to leave Gaza if they can, just because of, again, the very tough situation there. And about another third said they would like to leave Gaza for now as long as they could be guaranteed they'd be allowed to come back in. But obviously, they're very concerned that would not be the case. And so you get a majority of Gazans who seem to want to stay there under different conditions, with some potentially wanting to go. But both the Israelis and Egyptians at this point making that very difficult, if not impossible. Okay. Fifth challenge, governance for Gaza, right? So beyond just physical control or Israeli withdrawal or Hamas disarmament, like what is exactly the governance for Gaza going to look like going forward? So a few kind of key points, and then I'll go into some recent developments. According to the Trump plan, it's going to have like this two-tier structure. There's going to be this day-to-day administration by Palestinian technocrats, and this is a word you hear sometimes in other contexts as well. What's a technocrat? Basically someone who like knows how to work sewage systems or road construction or things like that, but is not driven by, loyalty to a particular party or organization, whether it's Hamas or Fatah or otherwise. This is the idea of like, let's just get people who can help rebuild, make the trains or the roads or whatever run on time, and then we can deal with kind of like political control later, and or have political control be controlled by some other folks. So in this case, there's supposed to be this board of peace, which Trump is going to chair, at least supposedly. Tony Blair is somehow going to be involved. And this board of peace is going to oversee Palestinian technocrats until you have these reforms by the Palestinian Authority, which again, by almost every actor's supposition, not just the Israelis, but also the Americans, the Europeans, and again, many Palestinians, the Palestinian Authority needs to have new elections, needs to have reform to get at some issues in terms of effective governance and corruption. And the idea is that if and when the PA does that, then they could potentially come in and have shared, if not full governance of the Gaza Strip. But it doesn't seem like that will happen anytime soon, but that's something that's part of the plan, at least laid out by the Trump administration. Again, general consensus that Hamas is not going to have any role in future governing. We'll see about that. And the key condition I think need to be paid attention to is what I list here at the bottom. If you are going to have effective governance, one of the foundational things that we talk about in political science in general is you need to have a monopoly on the use of legitimate violence. If you do not have a monopoly on the use of legitimate violence, it's incredibly difficult to have stable and effective governance. And there's a bunch of developments in the past couple of days that make me question whether that's actually going to happen. So, a couple of things. First, on the Israeli side, the Israelis at various points during the past 2 years, including today, have been backing different anti-Hamas leaders, some who are the leaders of different clans or others who have not been fully beholden to Hamas. And there have been shootouts and killings even before the past week or two, but some of them have escalated as now with the ceasefire, Hamas has tried to reassert authority, but then also the Israelis to varying points have backed some of these individuals and some of their armed groups. And there have been shootouts between Hamas and some of these groups. And then as you can see, a lot of these leaders, not coincidentally, are kind of based right over or inside the yellow line or yellow area. So they have, to some extent, Israeli protection. It's unclear from at least the publicly available documents that I've seen whether this is a full-scale effort by the Israelis to try to create an alternative leadership and military forces inside of Gaza to kind of topple Hamas, whether it's just another way to kind of fragment control inside of Gaza and make things tough for Hamas or make it tough to have a unified Palestinian voice. Like, I don't know enough in terms of what I've seen to make a judgment on that, but I will say that this is a real issue, and you may have seen pictures in the news of Hamas carrying out public executions of people that they consider to be collaborators with the Israelis or others. So this is a real issue, and it gets to the idea of governance because now, if there's any group right now that's trying to establish control of violence inside of at least the white area of Gaza, it's Hamas. And so the challenge here is that the Trump administration is saying Hamas is going to be disarmed and not going to be part of any future governance inside of Gaza. And yet the main thing Hamas is doing right now is, of course, the precise opposite of that. They're trying to rearm, they're trying to reestablish their authority inside of the territory, and they're not showing any inclination that they're going to kind of back off here. I think many of them feel like, as we'll talk about in just a moment, the Trump administration is not going to be fully serious about future phases of this deal. They got the living hostages out, they've got, a current ceasefire, and the Trump administration is either going to lose interest because of stuff with Ukraine or domestic American politics, or they're just going to realize getting Hamas out of power and disarming is just too tough of a nut to crack that they don't want to put a lot of political capital inside to. And so Hamas is preparing for the day after, but the way they're preparing is, basically antithetical to what the Trump administration is pushing for. Now, this does not mean this could be a temporary thing. Again, the Trump administration has been trying to organize international consensus, international force to go in there to disarm Hamas, negotiate towards a broader deal, etc. So it's very possible that these trends won't continue, but at least for now, the trends are going more and more towards Hamas reasserting control inside of at least this area of Gaza and trying to go after some of the challenges to their authority and their control. So this brings us to what I think is probably the most important factor about what comes next, which is how serious is Trump about peace and about this plan? Going back to that poll of Israelis before, I don't disagree that without the Trump administration's significant arm twisting and pushing of both Israelis and Palestinians, sometimes through regional proxies, this deal would not have happened. And we know that in part because you can look at prior failures for the Trump administration and the Biden administration trying to get deals that look exactly like this, but didn't have the same degree of kind of carrots and sticks and pressure that the Trump administration applied. So we're here where we are now in significant part because of pressure from the Trump administration. But the question is that pressure going to continue? And is the Trump administration's focus on this deal, which is not going to be done overnight or in a month or in a couple weeks at all? It is going to be a multi-year process if you want to accomplish all the things that he's listing there. Does the Trump administration have the stomach and the desire to make that happen? So just to give you a visual of what I just mentioned, even though this Trump plan, the 20-point plan, is presented as like a full and final agreement, it still has inherent phases built into it. And to be fair, there were prior phases built into the prior Trump plan that came soon after he was inaugurated and in some of the Biden plans. So the agreements generally have this first phase, which is like, okay, ceasefire, stop the major violence between Israelis and Hamas. Hamas releases hostages, some or all of them. Israel releases detainees, Palestinians that are being held without charge, as well as Palestinian prisoners that have been convicted of violence, sometimes going back decades. And that's kind of the first phase, right? Very palpable things. You release these people, you release these people, we stop shooting. That has been achieved twice now, right? Not just the past week or two, but also earlier in this Trump administration, they achieved a version of this. And then in the Biden administration, they achieved a version of this, which actually even had more Israeli hostages being released than under the Trump administration. But deals have always failed getting to this next stage, which is okay, now that we've had initial release of hostages and detainees and prisoners and ceasefire, now we need Hamas disarmament, Israeli withdrawal, etc. We have not achieved that. And there's a real question about whether we're going to achieve either of those things, let alone both of them. So this is where the previous deal failed, was in kind of phase two. And if you're betting, I would still say you wouldn't be in bad shape to bet that we're not going to get through phase two this time either, even though, again, I'm sure all of us to varying degrees are hopeful on parts, if not all of this. And then the real question is, leaving aside phase two, which is already very difficult to achieve given the incentives of both Israelis and Hamas in this case, will we ever get to kind of phase three, which again, the Trump administration says they want to achieve, which is an actual resolution of the conflict? Not just a ceasefire for the past 2 years, not just return of hostages and even Hamas being disarmed, which is not an only thing, like that would be a huge change, but an actual resolution to the conflict. Whether it's going to be a two-state solution or otherwise, will we ever get here? So as we go through degrees of difficulty, this first phase is very difficult, but as we've seen, it's been achieved twice. This second phase is quite difficult and has not been achieved, and is a real question whether it will be. And this third issue is one that I'm sure many people on this call have followed and maybe even tried to do for, decades and decades now. It's the most difficult of all, but it's certainly one that it seems like internationally has more support for let's try to make this happen than we've seen in recent years. So in terms of Trump's plan for Gaza, like it's worth noting, even though he's put in a lot of effort to kind of make what we currently see happen, there have been some prior things that make you question his degree of kind of seriousness here, right? In some prior speeches, he said, okay, the US is going to take over the Gaza Strip, or like he's, retweeting these kind of ridiculous videos of like what Gaza is going to look like thereafter. And again, some of this is kind of Trump's style as a politician, but whether this is going to be like a flash in the pan, I brought an end to this conflict, like give me a Nobel Peace Prize, or it's going to be, I'm going to roll up my sleeves and recognize both Hamas and the Israelis and the Palestinian Israeli people are going to object to various parts of what I'm trying to do, and they can wait me out, and they can do things that I don't expect to try to thwart my plans. Does he have the seriousness and the desire and the ability to push through that and continue to outmaneuver or pressure both Israelis and Palestinians to make the deal that he thinks should happen? That's a very open question, and I'm not sure what the answer is, and I welcome comments or questions related to that. I will say that, again, he did put some effort in his prior administration. This was the plan, the kind of quote unquote deal of the century that he put in the last time that he was in office, created by his son in law, Jared Kushner, as well as others. Kushner has kind of come back on the scene along with Witkoff for this current deal. But again, Trump did have visions in his last time in office of having something that would actually lead to an end to the conflict. Now, Israelis generally said that they were okay with this, even though some on the Israeli far right rejected this because Trump called what was in green there a Palestinian state. So folks like Smotrich said no, but Netanyahu said yes, but I think he didn't really think it would happen. On the Palestinian side, they generally rejected this and said, look, this is not any type of contiguous state. We don't have control of pretty much any part of Jerusalem. We lose control of the entire Jordan Valley and yada, yada, yada. So long and short, this was not something that was popular from the Palestinians, but at least to me, it showed an attempt by the Trump administration to say, okay, I'm going to try to lay out some final deal and push the parties to it. Ultimately, was ineffective at doing so. But, will he want to do something like this again, actually have engagement with each of the sides and try to make this happen along with the Europeans and Arab states? We'll see. Final point I'll raise on this, and then I'll pause again for some more extensive questions. Signals that at least for now, the Trump administration is serious on this. There's this term that the Israeli media is using these days called babysitting. So if you have seen this kind of constant stream of Trump administration officials in the area, right? Trump himself, Vice President Vance, Secretary of State Rubio, like all of these different leaders coming through, they're there in part, certainly to coordinate all of these moving parts here. But some of the argument is also because, hey, the last time there was a deal, Netanyahu certainly didn't want to go to phase two. So someone is trying to keep him moving towards the things that the Israelis need to do, while also monitoring the situation with Hamas and pushing Arab states to kind of make the concessions or the pressure that they need to have happen. Now, what's driving Trump to do this? I think he has some belief and desire to have broader peace in the region and stability. I also think that he cares a great deal about what he sees as like the gem of his first term in office and his foreign policy, which is the Abraham Accords. Having four other Arab states recognize Israel and normalize relations, even though, again, there's huge variation between, say, like Sudan on the one hand and the Emirates on the other, he wants to shore up the Abraham Accords and then expand it. And of course, expand it to what he would see as the crown jewel, which is Saudi Arabia. So even under the Biden administration, there were discussions with the Saudis trying to get them to do this. It did not happen. The Trump administration already is behind the scenes pushing very hard for this, and they would like the ceasefire to be a stepping stone to that. The challenge is that the Saudis have been very clear, at least in terms of their public statements, that just having a ceasefire and exchange of hostages and detainees is not enough for them to say, okay, now we're willing to negotiate and normalize with Israel. The Saudis have said very clearly, we either need a two-state solution and a Palestinian state, or we need an irrevocable process that has that as a goal that then we're going to move towards, and then our normalization could maybe happen along the way in that process before it's finalized. But the idea that the Saudis are going to normalize right now with the current conditions, it's possible, but I would bet against it. And it's one of the main reasons that the Trump administration has incentives to keep pushing things forward, not just in Gaza, but with Israelis and Palestinians more broadly, because that's the key step that you're going to get other Arab states, maybe not just the Saudis, but others who will normalize with Israel and lead to potentially a resolution for the conflict. The challenge is, of course, it's always chicken and egg. For the Israelis, they want recognition and normalization with the Arab states, and then they feel like, they're in a stronger position and can deal with the Palestinians. From the Arab states and Palestinians' perspective, they want a Palestinian state and that issue dealt with before they normalize with Israel. This goes back to the Arab Peace Initiative in 2002. So there is a little chicken and egg issue here. Of course, some of it can be a little step here, a little step there, but all of this goes back to none of this is going to happen without the Trump administration or U.S. administration pushing the parties to make this happen. Even though there's interest and incentive among each of them to make this happen, you need a strong coordinator that has leverage over various parties to make a deal like this occur. So it remains to be seen if the Trump administration will keep up this degree of diplomatic engagement and pressure as it has to this point. And again, I welcome people's thoughts and questions on that. Okay, that was a lot. I'll pause for a while and do some Q&A on present day situation in Gaza and challenges to the Trump plan and what comes next. And then we'll proceed to another section on polls of Israelis and Palestinians and how they're feeling about what comes next, who would they vote for in subsequent elections, etc. So I'm going to go back to the Q&A, and I'll especially start with questions related to the stuff I just presented, but I'll try to answer as many as I can. Okay, is the two-state solution possible given the fragmentation of Palestinian territory, as well as the unresolved issue of the right of return for Palestinian refugees? So it's correct to say there is more international support and push for a two-state solution than I've seen in a number of years. So if you believe in the possibility of a two-state solution, like that's a positive. But in terms of negatives, I think you point to a couple of them. First, if you look at polls of Israelis and Palestinians, you generally get less than half of them who believe, way less than half that believe a two-state solution is possible, and then hovering around half who support the idea. But usually it filters in when people say, do you support a two-state solution for both Israelis and Palestinians? They're both answering, yes, if we were able to achieve one, would I like it? But their answers are often colored by, do I think it's even possible, especially given the last 2 years? So not all Israelis, but many Israelis today feel like Palestinian state not only is maybe not possible in terms of two-state solution, but most Israelis agree with not just Netanyahu, but President Herzog or others, like to give a Palestinian state right now would be like a reward for October 7th. So there's not a lot of support among Israelis for a two-state solution today. On the Palestinian side, I think there's more support for it, but again, also lack of belief in it ever happening, and for some of the reasons you mentioned. Palestinians are divided, not just geographically, but they don't have a legitimate ruler that has a mandate from the Palestinian people. Most Palestinians look and don't believe the Israelis will ever give the concessions to make it happen, and Israel is certainly the more powerful side here. And Palestinians are much more skeptical about Trump. Trump does not have, 80, 90% approval rating among Palestinians. I think some Palestinians do feel like vis-a-vis Biden, Trump was able to deliver certain things. but most Palestinians would still be very anti-Trump and see him as very, pro-Israeli on the side of things, and not someone who in a real way will push for a Palestinian state. On the right of return, that goes to another issue on the refugees, which is, yes, according to international law, refugees are often, it's stated that refugees, should be allowed to kind of return to their homes if that's possible under a number of different conditions. Obviously, as I mentioned, that's been blocked by the Israelis on one side. And then in terms of the other thing that can happen, getting repatriated in another country, Arab states have generally blocked that. Under prior negotiations for a two-state solution, right of return is a very sensitive issue. The Israelis have never agreed to any significant return. At most, there's been some things that have been discussed where Israel would potentially admit some responsibility for the refugee situation and maybe allow some symbolic small number of refugees to come back. But generally, under any two-state solution that the Israelis would agree to, the return of refugees would be potentially returned to a state of Palestine in the West Bank and Gaza, not to like original homes inside of Israel. Now, that's very contentious, and a lot of Palestinians don't support that, but you pretty much will never get support for an Israeli two-state solution if that's not the basics of it. And so that's why if you go back to like the Clinton parameters or other agreements, that's kind of how it's been discussed. A couple other questions on two-state solution on the same topic, and I'll go to other ones. The two-state solution seems like a crutch for Western politicians. What does it even mean now? Good question. Look, I think two-state solution always means there's going to be a state of Israel alongside a state of Palestine. But in terms of what exactly the borders will be for that, how do you deal with refugees and settlements? How is Jerusalem divided? How do you deal with militarization stuff? Like those are all the final status issues that have never been fully decided. Now, can you look at things like the Clinton parameters or the Omer to offer things like this and say, okay, none of this is decided to everyone's satisfaction, but I can see a vision of like a state of Israel roughly where it is today, a state of Palestine and Gaza and most of the West Bank, Palestinian refugees being able to go to the state of Palestine, Jerusalem, where Israel maintains, West Jerusalem and holy sites like the Western Wall, but the Palestinians maybe get parts of East Jerusalem and Palestinian neighborhoods. Like these are things that I think are possible even under the current situation, but it's very, very difficult. It's concessions that people on both sides don't want to give. And there's a lot of distrust that if they give those concessions, the other side will hold up to the end of the bargain instead of just then having another conflict thereafter. So I don't think the two-state solution is just a buzzword, but I think you're not wrong to say, look, you have 700,000 plus Israeli Jews living in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. You have a lot of distrust among both parties because of the October 7th attacks, Israeli invasion of Gaza. So I think the two-state solution is still a real thing, but I think it's harder to achieve, especially in the current context. And it leads to a question I see right below here, which is, why isn't the one-state solution more popular? Equal rights for everyone, it seems, is the most logical solution. Okay, so let's talk about that. Just as there are different two-state solutions, right? So two-state just means state of Israel, state of Palestine, but can have huge variation in what are the borders of those states, what happens with Jerusalem, what happens with refugees, right? Those are all two-state solutions. There's not just one-state solution either. In fact, there's less of a difference between different two-state solution versions than there are one-state solutions. And I know the questioner is asking about one particular one, but let me just give the spectrum, then I'll answer about the one you're implying. So many Israelis today, particularly on the far right, believe in a one-state solution. Their version of one-state solution is Israel should annex most, if not all, of the West Bank, and then the rest of the West Bank and/or Gaza, maybe they become part of Jordan, maybe they become part of Egypt, maybe they maintain themselves as like, semi-autonomous territories that Israel controls. Like that's kind of like the Israeli one-state vision that people like Smotrich or Ben-Gvir or even, members of Likud potentially support. On the Palestinian side, Hamas has a one-state solution. Their vision is all of the territory becomes Palestine, Israeli Jews are generally killed or expelled, and like that's the one-state solution. So those are about as opposite as you can get. Now, the questioner, I think, is asking about a different version, which is kind of like the binational one-state solution, which is the borders between the West Bank and Gaza and Israel all go away. Everyone becomes a citizen and gets to vote. Under some versions of it, the Palestinian refugees get to come back, and then you have a vote. And then it's called, Israel, it's called Palestine, it's called Israelstein, whatever, but it would be a single state. Now, the reason that you get far more support from the Palestinian side than the Israeli side for that is not lost on anyone, which is, especially if you allow the refugees to return, the majority of the people living in that territory are going to be Palestinian. So not only are they not going to elect Benjamin Netanyahu as prime minister, they're not going to elect, Eisenkot or anyone else. They're going to elect, I don't know, Mustafa Barghouti or Marwan Barghouti or Sari Nusseibeh, or, a Palestinian. And so for Palestinians, it's a concession certainly for Palestinians to say, okay, we're still going to have all Israelis here, and if we don't like the settlements or otherwise, but we're going to have a state that's going to be majority, represented by us. For most Israelis, that's a no-go because it's basically an end to the idea of having a Jewish majority state and having a democratically elected government that's going to be have a Jewish character, which is the goal of Zionism. And they just don't obviously trust, in many cases as well, having a state in which they're living aside, alongside members of Hamas. And again, Palestinians in this scenario would have to live alongside, some of the far right settlers who are carrying out attacks against the IDF alongside Palestinians. But long and short, there is support for this idea of a binational one state, but it's not majority support and certainly not majority support among Israelis. That would be kind of the key sticking point, especially given that Israel's not just one of the two parties to the conflict, but they're also the more powerful party. So why we don't see a one state binational vision, I think that has a lot to do with it. Okay, some other questions here. Let me just keep scanning through. Where I lost my place. Okay, there we go. Didn't the UN vote for and Israelis accept 1949 some sort of mix of repatriation and compensation for Palestinian refugees in return for mutual peace and recognition, but this was not seriously considered by either the Palestinian or the neighboring Arab states? So you're not wrong that in terms of some of what you're saying, when you have the different UN resolutions, at various points, they're talking about, okay, there needs to be some, family reunification, but there also needs to be some compensation, etc. And it's not wrong to say, even though the Israeli Knesset in 48, passes that law about having the Palestinians not be able to return, there was more openness in the early days after the 48 war among the Israeli government for some type of repatriation or deal, whether it's part of a two-state solution as the UN was calling for or otherwise. You're not wrong that for Palestinians and for Arab states, the 48 wars was the catastrophe of the Nakba. They did not want to, and none of them did, recognize the state of Israel thereafter. And so any type of, consolidated agreement about dealing with the refugees, it's certainly something where Israel is saying, at least in voting, you can't come in, but also the Arab states not wanting to recognize or deal with the Israelis or repatriate any in their state with compensation. That's also part of the story. So yes, there seemed to be more possibility and openness to some of this stuff in the early days, but opinions have hardened even as the situation seemingly becomes less fluid in terms of how to deal with the refugee issue. Who outside of Arab and Muslim countries have the most sway on any final agreement? Look, the parties who have the most sway are the Israelis and Palestinians themselves, which is why whether we're talking about two-state solutions or one-state solutions, if you don't have buy-in from a strong majority of the Israeli people and the Palestinian people and their leaderships, you're probably not going to have a deal. Now, if you're saying outside of those peoples who has the most sway, Americans for sure, because America's not only the most powerful country in the region, they're really the only country that has leverage and can help reassure to some extent the Israeli side. On the Palestinian side, they definitely have alliances to some extent or support from some of the Arab states, but there's also distrust there, right? If you know the history from 48 onwards, I mean, Jordan annexed the West Bank when they controlled it. Egypt created this all-Palestine government in Gaza, but they continued to administrate it. So it's not like all of the Arab states have always been pushing for a state of Palestine. In fact, it's kind of a more recent thing in terms of them saying that that's what they actually all want in terms of the area. So yes, do Arab states matter? They do, because whether it's Syria or Iraq or a non-Arab but Muslim country like Iran recently, a number of those states have acted as spoilers to any type of two-state deal because either they don't want to recognize the state of Israel or, like the Syrians, they don't want a final deal to happen until like they get the Golan Heights back. So do those other Arab states matter in terms of agreement? Yes. When you get outside of Israelis, Palestinians, Americans, and Arab states, I think you could have a deal. Look, that's a lot of actors to get lined up. If you get those actors lined up, you'll get a deal. But others that I think still can make a difference. European states certainly matter. They provide a diplomatic and economic support on the Palestinian side. And also, a number of them, even though they've had chillier relations with the Israelis of late, have still been, major trading blocks for the Israelis through the EU. Countries like Russia and China still play a role. They can obviously block things at the UN if they want to veto stuff in the Security Council. But, these are kind of concentric circles moving outward, right? Of course, even like countries like South Africa or Argentina can like play a role here. But it's really Israelis and Palestinians, Americans and Arab states, Europeans and other powers kind of moving outwards. And the more you get that core moving out, the more likely you can get some type of final agreement. Do I think Arab countries would give the Jews that they expelled their property back? If they won't, why should Israel return any property to Palestinians? I do think, I don't know if they'd give them their property back. I would also say, to be clear, I'm sure there are some Mizrahi Jews in Israel that maybe would like to move back, but I think a majority of them that I know in polls I've seen, Mizrahi Jews inside of Israel are not asking to move back to their property, but they would like to have compensation for it, or maybe again be able to own it but not actually live there, which is maybe what you're implying here. So, do I think that's possible? I do. I think that there are certainly hard feelings between some of those populations and their governments. Again, the story is not all the same everywhere. In some places, like say in Iraq, there was violence against the Jewish people even before 48 that had an impact on them wanting to leave. In some other places in North Africa, there's definitely Mizrahi Jews I've talked to who said, we had a decent, good life here, but ultimately we wanted to move to Israel because we thought that would be a better place for us. So it's a mixed story. Like the Mizrahi experience is not a uniform one, but it is correct, as you're saying here, and as I mentioned before, a number of the Mizrahi had their lands or property confiscated in any final deal, and this has been talked about before. Do I think you can get a number of those states to agree to compensation alongside if there's also compensation paid to Palestinian refugees? I do think that's possible. I think certain countries like, say, Algeria will be harder nuts to crack than others like, say, Morocco or Tunisia, but I do think it's possible if you have a broader deal. Okay, still going through all these questions here. I'm scrolling up a bit. Um, how can we imagine peace when Hamas continues to insist it will never make peace, promising more and more October 7th? So yeah, look, one of the terms that I use for the current the conflict in the past 2 years is like the war of the spoilers. On the Palestinian side, one of the times that when Hamas initially comes to power, I mean, Hamas gets founded during the first Intifada, and they really start to become even more powerful during the second Intifada. They get more powerful when peace doesn't happen because the narrative that they say to Palestinians is that you can't trust the Israelis. The Israelis only understand the language of force. We are the resistance that protects you, the broader Palestinian people. And so, in times of violence or the peace process not working, and again, Khalil Shikaki and other Palestinian pollsters have shown this, support for Hamas goes up. And so, if you want to say, how can we envision peace when Hamas is like the major party to deal with? I don't think you're wrong to say it's difficult to imagine peace in terms of a two-state solution with Hamas being a major party. Now, is it possible that Hamas could go through a trajectory like Fatah did, by the way? I mean, Fatah used to kill Palestinians who talked about a two-state solution, used to be the ones who was launching attacks against Israeli civilians, and then Fatah ultimately evolves, recognizes the state of Israel under Oslo, basically gives up its armed wing, decommissions the PLO, and now is seen by many Palestinians as like collaborators to varying degrees, at least through the PA with the Israelis. Like, could Hamas go through a trajectory like that? Maybe. Many Israelis are skeptical because of Hamas's both religious convictions and kind of hardline leadership and support from places like Iran, but possible. But I don't think you're wrong to imply if Hamas is leading the Palestinians, it's both less likely maybe that peace is going to result, but it's also a chicken and egg thing. Hamas is also probably leaders of the Palestinians because the peace process is in the dumpster, if that makes sense. Okay, other questions. One on the other side of the coin on kind of a similar issue. Couldn't it be said that it would be a reward for Israel's genocide to allow it to keep its expanded territory? As long as Israel continues to get unlimited weapons and money, what are its incentives to stop trying to expand and finally draw borders? How can Israel be constrained given its formidable lobby? Okay, lots of questions there. So the previous question was on how do you envision peace if like Hamas's leadership or restrain Hamas? This question is, hey, in terms of reward, what about the death that Israel has caused over the past 2 years? How do you restrain the fact that Israel is the most powerful actor in the region? How do you get them to come to the table? They obviously have strong support in the American government. Like, how do you deal with all of these things? Okay, a lot of questions there. So I'll say a couple of things. First, if we are getting into like rewards for things, right? Whether it's like rewarding Hamas or rewarding Israel, I understand how people feel that way, but I'll also say that this is a conflict that has been going on and off for generations, to which there's already, unfortunately, enough tragedies and brutally awful things and war crimes that each side has committed against the other, that we will always have this litany of stuff that we can point to and say, when you are making a deal with these people or shaking their hands, you are rewarding XYZ thing that happened. Unfortunately, that will never go away, and one could always make that argument. If I'm trying to make the argument for why we can try to have a better future, it's going to have to be like a piece of brave individuals who say, I have not forgotten the things that have been happened to my people from the other side. I have not forgotten my desire to advocate for my people's safety and security and statehood and otherwise. But ultimately, I need to make peace with some people who are my enemies, not just my friends. And it doesn't mean I'm excusing these other things. And if we're talking about like justice and reconciliation, things like that, when we talk about peace processes, it's usually like negotiations toward two-state solution. But to have a real peace also at like kind of the civil or citizen level, might there need to be like truth and reconciliation commissions or things that happen in educational systems that reconcile some of this stuff on each side? Yeah, I think that probably needs to be part of it. But in terms of the reward stuff, I understand the narrative on each side. But if you're going to have a deal to some extent that has to be overcome, and you have to have leaders and people who feel like we're willing to overcome that. In terms of restraint of Israel given its strength, look, Israel is by far the more powerful party here. I don't think that's going to change anytime soon, both because Israel's a successful economy and has a strong and well-trained military. They certainly do have strong support from the Americans, which I don't think is going to go away anytime soon, even though you see more fracturing in the Democratic Party. And so I'll be interested to see with a new generation of Democratic leaders, if one of them gets elected president in the next decade or so, I think there'll still be decent support for Israel, but will it be less than you saw under Biden and Trump? Very possibly. That being said, I think that that's why the United States plays a key role. You're not wrong that Israel has a lot of support in US Congress and among Americans, by the way, despite the shift towards more Americans who identify as pro-Palestinian. You still have a significant number of Americans who identify themselves as pro-Israeli. And even if some of them don't love the Netanyahu government, many of them are very committed to Israeli security and the safety of the Israelis. But that's why I think the Americans are essential to the deal, because the Israelis, many of them, even the ones who want a two-state solution, because they believe it's good for the future of Israel, whether demographically or security-wise or acceptance in the region, they recognize that they're probably not going to get there without American assurances and guarantees and American pressure to push them to the table. In fact, that's why you see among polls of Israelis say things like, we wouldn't have gotten these hostages without the Trump administration's pressure, because the Netanyahu administration, either because of domestic concern about losing their coalition or otherwise, is not able to kind of get to that point at various issues because they don't want to be outbid on like who's harder line on Hamas or whatever else, right? So I think your points are well taken in terms of the relative strength of the Israelis and concerns about reward. But there's ways I think those can be circumvented, whether we're talking about Hamas or we're talking about Israeli politicians. All right, Israelis and many Palestinians are not ripe, quote unquote, for moving towards a political resolution. What do you think needs to happen before they are? Excellent question. So there's a terminology we use in political science about the ripeness for negotiation. And it gets the idea that, like, of course, not every context and time is a perfect one to actually make a deal. So what makes for a more ripe timing? Certainly like supportive publics or leaderships that are willing to take political risks for peace. Situations where, again, unfortunately, we don't have what we had the past 2 years, which is 1,200 Israelis killed in really brutal attacks, tens of thousands of Palestinians killed in brutal attacks, hostages taken, detainees held. Like the stuff that's happened the past 2 years is pretty much the worst possible situation to get Israeli and Palestinian publics to want to make a deal, minus one factor, which is war weariness and a feeling like, as much as I have infinite grievance against this other community and don't trust them, I think there's almost any Palestinian or Israeli you ask would say, do you want to repeat the past 2 years? Is this reality you want to live in? And pretty much everyone would say no. Now, it doesn't mean the answer isn't, and now what we need to do is be more aggressive against them. But it does mean for some, it might be like, okay, we can't fight these people forever. We can't control them forever or dismiss them forever or believe on either side that they're just going to go away. And so we need to ultimately find a way to reconcile and negotiate and find a deal with them, even if it's a deal in which we continue not to trust them or continue not to fully rely on them for our own security. We need to be able to protect ourselves. So what makes for ripeness? What would be a key factor? There need to be elections in each community. The current leaderships you see, whether it's Hamas, which if you want to call them leadership of the Palestinian community, or a coalition in Israel that includes people like Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, like those are not the people that are going to negotiate. Again, if your goal is a two-state solution, maybe your goal is like the Ben-Gvir vision of a one-state solution or the Hamas vision, right? But those are not really negotiated outcomes. Those are more imposed outcomes by one side that wins. If you're talking about a negotiation, a la what Trump is seeming to suggest, whether you want to call it a two-state solution or not in some form, there probably needs to be leadership change and elections. Elections because you need to have governments that feel like and do have a mandate from their people. And you could argue that neither one does today. The Palestinians certainly, Hamas last elected in 2006, Abbas, there that time and a little after, depending on how you want to look at it. Both of them don't have majority support of Palestinians, so you don't have a cohesive, legitimate Palestinian leadership to negotiate with. So that's key. And then even on the Israeli side, yes, the Netanyahu administration was freely and fairly elected, but they have faced a lot of polls over the past few years that show that they don't have a support of the majority of Israelis. Obviously, the context has changed a lot. So even if Netanyahu were to get reelected, that would make a little bit difference in terms of his mandate from the Israeli people. But if he is not reelected and or if his coalition is not the same, and you get some more people from the Israeli center or center left, those are some of the people who I think are more willing to negotiate towards certainly a two-state solution. So on the Palestinian side, no guarantee we're going to see elections, but they're called for under Trump, and the Palestinian leadership has said they'll try to have them in the next year. We'll see. I'll talk about that in a moment. On the Israeli side, they are obligated to have elections by October of 2026. The majority of Israelis want to have them before then. We'll see if that happens. But there should be Israeli elections in the next year. There may be Palestinian elections, but having those elections themselves and then certainly the outcome of them, that to me can make a more ripe scenario alongside other developments that again would give each side courage and pause for this, right? If all of the Israeli hostages come back, if Hamas starts to be disarmed, if Israel starts to withdraw more from Gaza, if you get more support from Arab states and others to rebuild and move towards talking to the Israelis about normalizing and supporting the Palestinians, etc., like all of those things make it for a riper scenario. So outside actors make a difference, but the biggest factor to me is internal elections. Okay, I see many more questions, but I want to turn back to this last section, which builds right on these questions about elections, and then I'll answer even more questions for everybody. Okay. So hopefully I'm seeing almost, sometimes when I do go back and forth in this, you see all my notes and stuff too, which is fine, but I'm not looking at my notes. I'm just looking at the screen. So hopefully you're as well. Let's look at some polls of both Israelis and Palestinians on a couple of issues. Someone was asking for about October 7th and various supports for it. So there is, by the way, and I try to give you sources on the polls. If you go to PCPSR, which is again listed here on the bottom right, they have polls actually by different months of the percentage of Palestinians who said October 7th was like the right idea. And it starts actually pretty high, but you can actually see it goes below 50% in Gaza in some of those recent polls. So you see shifts there over time. This is a slightly different poll, but it gets at both sides of the coin. So this was a joint poll done between Tel Aviv University and the Palestinian Center for Survey and Policy Research, or Policy and Survey Research. And Israelis and Palestinians were basically asked on the Palestinian side, does Palestinian suffering under the siege and blockade of the Gaza Strip before October 7th justify what Hamas did on October 7th? So it's a version of asking if you support or okay with October 7th, but added, like, is it justified given these things that happened to Palestinians before? You can see that for a majority of Palestinians, a strong majority, about 80%, Palestinians say yes. It doesn't mean that they necessarily support the October 7th attacks, but do they feel like it's justified given what happens before? You get a strong majority of Palestinians who say that, whether it's West Bankers or Gazans. And then also, interestingly, Israeli Arabs or Palestinian citizens of Israel, depending on the terminology you use, a minority of them, again, these are the 21% that live inside Israel as citizens, see it as justified. So a difference there in terms of those in the West Bank and Gaza versus those inside of Israel. Israelis were asked kind of a counter to this, which is, do Israeli Jews believe that what Hamas did on October 7th justifies what Israel did in the Gaza Strip since October 7th in the aftermath? And you get actually a very similar percentage. 84% of Israeli Jews saying, given what Hamas did on October 7th, we Israelis feel like what Israel did in Gaza is justified. So these polls, to be honest, are not necessarily the most heartening in some sense, even if they're understandable, because what you have are these populations that both feel like even if brutal things happen to the other community, we feel like those actions were justified given that what happened to our community and what that side did to our community. So this is an important backdrop to anything we talk about with elections or negotiations, that these polls were done. Again, this is about a year ago in September, but I don't think you'll get huge differences today. Maybe slight decreases today given the ceasefire, but I think this still represents a lot of how Palestinians and Israelis are thinking about the violence over the past 2 years. Now, let's talk about Palestinians and then talk about Israelis in terms of a number of other specific polls. So another challenge to disarmament of Hamas. Now, to be clear, this was asked in May. I do think that these percentages would change. It's just unlike the Israelis, where you can get like weekly polls or even more often in terms of who supports who for elections. Polls for Palestinians are there and they're good, but they're not as often because of some of the difficulties of polling Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. But in May of this year, Palestinians were asked, do you support or oppose the disarmament of Hamas in the Gaza Strip in order to stop the war? Interestingly, you get far more Gazans who say they support that, but still a minority. So important to note, it's not just Hamas that's resistant to disarm. A significant number of Palestinians have said in varying ways they don't want Hamas to disarm either. And again, to be clear, it's not because all of them, although some of them do, but not all of them like love Hamas, but some of them also feel like, well, if Hamas gives up its arms, we basically have no shield or no deterrent force or anything vis-a-vis the Israelis. So it's one of the reasons that you get polls along these lines about what percentage of Palestinians say they want Hamas to actually disarm. Now, when you get to this other question, do you support or oppose the expulsion of Hamas leaders? Then you get almost 50-50 in Gaza saying we support that, although less so in the West Bank. Again, getting to the idea of in Gaza, in some ways, there's less support for Hamas, or people who feel like they borne more the brunt of Hamas's actions than in the West Bank. But nonetheless, again, I want to present the reality to you. In May, you still had a significant number of Palestinians who are saying, even if it ends the war, we don't necessarily support the idea of disarming Hamas or expelling Hamas leadership. Again, I think the percentage would be a little bit different today. Now there's actually a deal on the table that's happening, but important to note the last time these questions were asked. Now, going more directly to who the Palestinians would elect if they do indeed have elections. So first, this was asked back in May, asked about, well, actually, this may be a little bit before. Well, yeah, so this is asked in May, but it changes depending the person because, Sinwar was not alive then. But basically, Palestinians are being asked, if you have Mahmoud Abbas, the head of the PA and the PLO and Fatah on the one side, and then the other side, some Hamas leader. So at some points, they asked about Ismail Haniyeh, who has been killed, Sinwar, who has been killed, both killed by the Israelis, or Khaled Meshal, who's still around. Who would you vote for? Interestingly, you see Hamas gets more support, or the Hamas leader gets more support than Mahmoud Abbas does in pretty much every poll in pretty much every area. But if that's all you look at, you're kind of missing a lot of the key points, which is the most common answer that Palestinians say is, I will not participate in elections. And it's not because Palestinians don't like to vote. You get strong majorities of Palestinians who say they want to live in a democracy and have regular elections. It's just they don't like either of these people. So the most common Palestinian feeling these days is, I do not support Mahmoud Abbas and the PA. I do not support Hamas. I want new or different leadership, but you're not kind of offering that to me, both in the poll that you're asking me, but also in terms of the actual electoral process, which has been controlled significantly by these groups in recent years. This is kind of the unrepresented voice of the Palestinians that in almost all of these polls, you get a significant, if not majority block saying this. So if you're asking me who would win free and fair elections among the Palestinians that had everybody potentially running who wanted to, etc., I think that's a very tough question to answer because many Palestinians are disgusted or disappointed by the different people that are on offer and the leaderships that are on offer there. Now, there is a little bit more consensus when you add this other individual, this guy named Marwan Barghouti. If you don't know who Marwan Barghouti is, he was kind of one of the young guard of Fatah. Again, he's now in his, at least his 60s, if not his 70s. But he is a rival to Mahmoud Abbas, one of the people who kind of led the charge in the last election, saying that the leadership has become ineffectual and corrupt. He and some of his friends kind of running at various points in 2006, going against both the old guard of Fatah alongside Hamas. He is probably the single most popular Palestinian political figure for a couple of reasons. Number one, he has the credibility of someone who during the first Intifada and otherwise is working with the Shabiba, basically the Palestinian or Fatah's youth organization, organizing protests on the streets, advocating for the Palestinian people, facing arrest or otherwise. For those who like the fact that hey, when that doesn't work, do other things. Like Barghouti, after many years of organizing protests and doing things like this, was like, I don't think this is ultimately going to work. Gets organized with the Tanzim, which basically becomes this renewed armed wing of Fatah, and then is involved, again, according to the accusations and convictions in Israel, involved in planning a number of attacks against Israelis in the Second Intifada. Now, what distinguished Barghouti from Hamas is whereas Hamas carried out and justified attacks against Israeli civilians inside of Israel, Barghouti said, I believe in the idea of a two-state solution. I'm supporting attacks inside of kind of the West Bank and Gaza. When he ultimately is held prisoner by the Israelis, he helps to create something called the prisoner's document, which is simultaneously saying, we, the Palestinians, want to be able to reconcile and bring together different Palestinian factions so we're not divided, but also we're open to the idea of negotiating with Israel towards a two-state solution. So if you want someone who can get at these two issues simultaneously, lack of a cohesive, legitimate Palestinian leadership, but also one that's willing to negotiate and recognize Israel and have a two-state solution, Barghouti's probably your guy. And it's one of the reasons that if you see in the news sometimes, he's described as like, a Palestinian Mandela. For those who sometimes just have a very shallow vision of who Mandela was, Mandela was not just a political leader in the ANC, he was also one of the leaders of the MK, an armed part of the ANC that struggled against apartheid in South Africa. So again, for a number of Israelis, they have pause for the fact that like Barghouti is accused of being involved in violent attacks against the Israelis. But again, a lot of the people who shake hands and make these deals, whether it was Arafat shaking hands with Yitzhak Rabin, both of who are responsible for a lot of death and killing of the other community, this is sometimes what happens. Regardless of your opinions on Barghouti, and again, there's a lot of different opinions on him, when you ask Palestinians about Barghouti vis-a-vis leaders of Hamas, and a lot of polls, he sometimes even doubles up leaders of Hamas and shrinks the number of people who say they won't participate. Now, he's currently held in Israeli prison. There's no guarantee he's going to get out, but there have been some news stories that the Trump administration may try to push the Israelis to have him released or otherwise. We'll see. In terms of who the successor will be to Mahmoud Abbas, who's now 89 or 90 years old, Barghouti would probably be the Palestinian people's choice, although it's not guaranteed. But actually, the more likely person at the moment is this guy, Hussein al-Sheikh. So Hussein al-Sheikh is kind of like the Abbas next generation, someone who is both has history in the Fatah movement and the PA for sure, and controls a lot of the passes that Palestinians get to be able to go into Israel, but he's also seen as acceptable to the Israelis and to the Americans. So Abbas actually recently just said, if I'm incapacitated or otherwise, Hussein al-Sheikh should take over. So he's kind of now the named successor for Abbas. Whether he would win in an election, I think is much less likely. It's not that he's necessarily fully unpopular among Palestinians, but having him be appointed and not accountable to the Palestinians kind of gets back to this whole issue here. So he's a possibility. Mohammed Dahlan, more of a dark horse, but someone who has a lot of support among some of the Arab states. But again, it might not be any of these individuals if there really truly are free and fair elections among the Palestinians, because you don't have this developed, organized Palestinian opposition, in part because the PA has pushed down on it and repressed it in the West Bank, and Hamas has repressed it in Gaza. So again, a very frustrated Palestinian public, most of whom want to have elections, most of whom are skeptical they're actually going to happen. Okay, let's go to the Israeli side. I had that Israeli voice before talking about Israeli perspectives on what's going to happen next. When Israelis were asked, do you think there's a low likelihood that the next stage of the agreement, which includes distancing Hamas from control of Gaza and establishing this multinational body, is that going to happen? Basically, 66% of Israelis say they don't think it's going to happen. 72% of Israeli Jews. Arab Israelis or PCIs are the most optimistic, but whether we're talking left, right, and center, there's not a lot of belief in the fact that we're going to get through this next stage. Now, in terms of Israeli polls, again, they're very difficult to kind of look at over time, but you also get a lot more of them. This is just a graph I pulled from Wikimedia Commons that shows all these different Israeli polls going back to 2022 in terms of how all of these, dozen plus Israeli political parties have performed in the polls. I'll just go through a couple points here. You can see directly in the days after October 7th, Likud, which is the darker line here, goes way down. And then like Benny Gantz and others' coalition goes way up. So these were the days where it was like, okay, Netanyahu is going to be finished as a major politician because of not stopping October 7th, etc. The anti-Netanyahu coalition is going to go way up. But then as you see, as things go over time, Likud again becomes the strongest party. Now, to be clear, they're still under 30 mandates, and which is less than a quarter of the Knesset. So they're not going to have a majority, but under current polls, they still would be the largest party. Of course, as you know, if you follow Israeli elections, being the largest party does not mean that you get to be in the government or have the prime minister. It comes down to coalitions. So these are just, again, you can see there's Israeli polls all the time. Just from the past week or so, a bunch of different polls that show Netanyahu's kind of governing coalition. So Likud, this is Ben Gvir's party, Shah's United Toward Judaism, kind of the ultra-Orthodox, versus the opposition bloc, right? Yair Lapid, the Democrats, which is basically Labor plus Meretz, Naftali Bennett. Again, I'm not going to go through all of these, but long and short, neither coalition currently has a majority. And if the polls hold for right now, you couldn't get a Jewish Israeli majority without bringing in Arab parties to your coalition, which has happened, but has often kind of been a no-no, especially for the Israeli right. So those of you who remember, 4 or 5 Israeli elections in the span of a couple years, if elections happen today, at least according to the polls, we may be returning to that again, where it's like the pro and anti-Netanyahu bloc are just neck and neck, and it's going to depend on like electoral engineering of which parties combine or don't combine to get over the threshold, but a pretty split public here, which there's some surprise there. Many people thought Netanyahu was going to be finished after October 7th. Some of it is the lack of actually a competing Israeli leader that Israelis really trust, but also some of it is some of the continuation of the war and maybe successes he's had with Hezbollah and Iran and otherwise that have reboosted some of his support. Okay, couple final points I'll make, and then we'll turn to some final round of questions. Things to watch before our next session. So next two sessions, third one coming up in November is going to focus on Iran and Israeli relations. And the fourth one's going to focus on the Abraham Accords, which we'll see by that point. There may be some more negotiations to expanding them. There may not, but we'll talk about it. But some things to watch. Progress on the ceasefire, hostage return, Israeli withdrawal, Hamas disarmament. Like, let's see over the next month if any of those things progress. Will Saudi-Israeli normalization be back on the table or not? Let's see. Going into next session, snapback sanctions have happened on Iran from Europe and elsewhere, which is really gutting the already weakened Iranian economy. So keep an eye on what happens there. Is Iran going to try to lick its wounds and rebuild the quote unquote axis of resistance in Lebanon and Iraq, with Hamas and others? We'll see. And then finally, neither party has shown strong inclinations here. They've each kind of made their demands and separated, but could there be a renewal of negotiations on nuclear issues between the Trump administration and Khamenei? We'll see. Okay, with that said, again, if you want to reach out to me, again, can always connect with me on LinkedIn or check out my website, but I'm going to go to a final round of questions, particularly on things I just mentioned regarding Israeli and Palestinian popular opinion. Okay. Recently, several sheikhs in the West Bank proposed to recognize Israel, leave the PA, and start to create a two-state solution. What is your opinion on that effort? Can it bloom into a full-fledged Palestinian state? Could these be leaders like Ansar al-Assad in Egypt that lead to peace? So I'll be honest, I'm pretty skeptical of that initiative. It's not that it's impossible. It's just these types of things have happened before. Israel, since it's controlled the West Bank and Gaza, has had numerous initiatives where they've tried to kind of prop up alternative leaderships, first to Fatah and the PLO, then to Hamas, as we've seen, and otherwise, sometimes through elections, sometimes through, support or otherwise. It's not that I don't feel like those sheikhs in Hebron aren't, indigenous leaders of the Palestinians who are proud in terms of their background, etc. But I think that when you have these individual leaders that are not coming from strong mandated support from the Palestinians, that aren't part of elections, that are seen as like working with the Israelis directly first before they're building up that support, I think it's, if not doomed to fail, very unlikely. So look, we're in the era of like Fatah and the PA have been weakened, Hamas has been weakened, so there will be these green shoots of other different Palestinian groups and leaders that may arise. But for that particular initiative, I'm skeptical. Let's just put it that way. Given the power of Barghouti, why won't the Israelis release him? Look, again, the Israelis have convicted Barghouti, I think, for 5 life sentences for his involvement in some of the violence in the Second Intifada. So for some of them, it's just like, that's a no-go. Although, to be fair, the Israelis just released 250 of people that fit some of that profile with Hamas, and Hamas actually did ask for Barghouti's release. There's a lot of hypotheses on this. One could be, if I'm the Netanyahu government, I don't want a Palestinian state, the last thing I want to do is release the guy who could help lead to that Palestinian state and have the support for it. So some of it could be that. Some of it could be that, honestly, like Mahmoud Abbas probably doesn't want him out either. So the Palestinians may be saying behind the scenes, like, don't let him out because he'll challenge our control of Fatah or otherwise. So a lot of the powers that be don't necessarily want Barghouti out, even if he has significant popular support. Okay, other questions. Which opposition parties in Israel are advocating for a two-state solution? Great question. I mean, historically, the two-state solution, was in one form or another, and not everyone do it, like the province of Labor and Mapai and Meretz, even though, again, even Yitzhak Rabin himself, when he's negotiating seemingly towards a two-state solution, doesn't necessarily use that exact terminology, and there's some argument that, he wanted something short of a state. So you're not wrong if you're implying that there aren't a ton of Israeli political parties that are making that part of their platform. That being said, do I think that with a solution that involved U.S. carrots and sticks, potential normalization with Arab states, etc., that Israeli left and even centrist parties could agree to it? Yes.
I could even see a scenario, again, very unlikely, but a scenario in which, for whatever reason, for his own political support and survival, whatever, Netanyahu has a coalition that's not with, Otzma Yehudit and others. It's with center or left parties that he tries to be the guy who delivers this final deal and normalization and all of this stuff. Unlikely, but possible. But you're not wrong to say, is mandating and pushing for a two-state solution a key thing for many Israeli parties today? It is not, even though you can get close to half of the Israeli public that say, if it could happen and actually be successful, they would support it. All right, we're at 2 o'clock, so I'm just going to answer one final question here. In my opinion, what is most likely to happen next? We proceed to the next phase of the peace plan. Ceasefire continues, resumption of the war. Look, if I'm setting odds here, I think unfortunately you're not wrong to bet against significant progress beyond what we've seen. What do I mean by that? A situation where maybe there's some efforts at Hamas disarmament and some push to have Israelis withdraw more. But if you're betting, especially in the near term, that Israel maintains control of significant parts of Gaza and Hamas maintains its ability to be an armed force, even if more on the margins, I think, unfortunately, if you're looking for the plan to work, that's the most likely bet. Now, if Trump is serious and continues to push and continues to build his coalition externally or otherwise, could I see in the next 6 months Israel withdraw more, all the dead hostages get returned, Hamas gets marginalized, they try to start to have this technocratic government? Like, I could see those things. But the idea of true negotiations towards a two-state solution that are able to be enacted or otherwise, to me, that's going to have to come after elections among each side. And if it is pushed before then, I'm not sure if it's going to actually work. I think it would fall apart. So I would say I have hopeful skepticism, where I'm skeptical about these next steps being realized in terms of the plan. But I give hope both because I care about the Israeli and Palestinian peoples, but also because I do think that there's internal desire and external desire to varying degrees to not have what's happened the past 2 years repeat itself and to have a different future. So, regardless of exactly what I think will happen, let's hopefully everyone join me in hoping that we have a better situation a month from now when we talk than we do now, and some of these things progress. So, thank you so much. I know it was a lot of me talking with you today, but I hope I was able to answer a number of your questions. I know there's still dozens I couldn't get to. I tried to answer as many different people as I could. Please do attend the next sessions coming up in November and December. I have some other talks going on at the MIT community as well if you want to join in person or otherwise. But thank you so much, and I hope you have a great day.